Brian, ready when you are. Aloha.
Mahalo, Eric. Kia ora, everyone, and welcome to the second day of the 10th Symposium of the ICTM Study Group for Music and Dance of Oceania. My name is Brian Dietrich, and it's my pleasure to once again welcome you here. I'm coming at you from Te Herengawaka, Victoria University of Wellington in New Zealand. We have a very short opening presentation for today before we move into the first session. I'll remind you that East West Center is recording this symposium and ask you to please feel free to write in the chat box, say hello, where you're zooming in from. We'd love to hear from you on there. I'm really delighted that our opening presentation comes from Otto Sims. Otto was someone who, like many of us, was hoping to journey to FESPAC in 2020. In order to introduce the presentation and the video we're about to see, I'd like to welcome Dr. Georgia Curran, and she is a research fellow at the Sydney Conservatorium of Music at the University of Sydney. Her interests include Indigenous Australian music and languages, performance, ethnography, and ethnomusicology. Thank you so much, Georgia, for being here.
Mahalo nui to all the organisers for this symposium, and thanks, Brian, and everyone for the invitation to share this performance. I'm speaking to you from Gadigal Indigenous lands of the Sydney region in Australia, and I'm grateful for the opportunity to introduce Otto Jumarai Sims. Otto is a Walpuri man from the Tanami Desert region of Central Australia. He lives in the community of Yuendumu in the south of Walpuri country. The dance that you'll see in a moment is a which was performed at the Aboriginal Tent Embassy, which is a permanent site of protest to acknowledge the political rights of Aboriginal peoples across Australia. And it's located on the lawns of Old Parliament House in Canberra. Pulapa are a public genre of Walpuri song involving men and women, and which were held frequently in the past, in the 1960s and 70s, mostly for fun entertainment. Nowadays, pulapa are rarely held, so this is a very special performance. Otto's passion for cultural continuation and vitality led him to instigate this as a way of sharing his Walpuri culture with the broader world. And as mentioned, he was very much looking forward to coming to a FESPAC last year and was very disappointed when that was cancelled. But we look forward to it happening again in the coming years. For anyone who's interested in reading further about this pulapa, Otto and I have written a paper which will be coming out in the next issue of the Asia Pacific Journal of Anthropology in June. Mahalo.
Thank you very much, Otto, for that presentation, and also Georgia. And as a reminder, we'll be hearing more from Georgia's research coming up in the first session. And now we're turned to that first session, and it's my pleasure to introduce the chair of that session. Dr. Catherine Grant is a music researcher, educator, and author on music endangerment and sustainability, based at Queensland Conservatorium Griffith University in Australia. It's my really great pleasure to welcome Kathy to this session. Thanks very much for leading us, Kathy.
Thanks very much, Brian, and please give me a nod if you can hear me loud and clear. Thank you. And I'd like to add my thanks to Brian's, to Otto and Georgia for that very beautiful way to start the day, that video and performance. So as Brian said, my name's Kathy, and it's my very great privilege to be chairing this session on Indigenous relationships with place, Aotearoa and Australia. And I'm coming to you today from Brisbane in Australia, and I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of this beautiful land where I live and work, the land of the Jagera and Turrbal peoples. And I want to extend that respect to the traditional custodians of the land where you're joining this conference from, and indeed to all First Nations peoples in Australia, in Aotearoa, in Oceania and beyond. And a very special warm welcome to First Nations delegates attending the session this morning. So we have 3 papers in this session, which I'm so much looking forward to. We'll have opportunity at the end of the session for questions and discussions. The first paper in the session is by Mary Harmee, who unfortunately is unable to join us live, but she has happily recorded her presentation for us. And if anyone does have any questions for Mary about her presentation, I understand that the organisers are happy to put you in contact with her after today. So Mary is a Kaupapa Maori researcher in Aotearoa, New Zealand, and an ecomusicology doctoral candidate at Victoria University of Wellington. And Mary's paper is called Hei Wiringa Muka, the relationship between the Wanganui River, Marae, and Waiata. And thank you, Brian and Eric. I believe the video is in your hands.
Tēnā tātou katoa. Ere kau mai te awanui mai te kahoi maunga ki Tangaroa, ko o te ao, ko te ao ko au. Ko te ati hanui a pāpārangi, ko Ngāti Rangi, ko Ngā Rarikitahi, ko Ngāti Tūwaretoa, Ngā Iwi, ko Ngāti Hine Korako, ko Ngāti Roaka, ko Ngāti Hine Ariki, Ngā Hapu, ko Rānana, ko Te Paurongo, Ngā Marae, ko Miri Harmee tōko ingoa, no Singapore tōku mama, nō reira tēnā koutou katoa. Nau mai, haere mai, me hoki mai, me wakarongo mai, kei te kōrero au, tō mahi, ko he wiringa muka, the relationship between the Wanganui River, Marae and Waiata, nō reira tēnā tātou katoa. Kia ora everybody, my name is Midi, thank you for having me. I'm here to talk about my doctoral studies called He Wiringa Muka, the relationship between the Wanganui River, Marae and Waiata. I'm a doctoral candidate and I'm currently enrolled at Te Koki New Zealand School of Music and Te Kawa a Maui, which is from Te Hiringa Waka at Victoria University of Wellington, based in Aotearoa, New Zealand. And I also want to give a shout out to my supervisors, Dr. Brian Dietrich and also Dr. Mike Ross for being my supervisors and helping me out along the way. So I don't think it would be a presentation about Māori song, which is Waiata, if I didn't start off by singing something. So I wanted to sing this pau, or a short chant, and I think it contextually fits as to the reasonings why I did this, or I'm doing this study currently. So I'll sing it and then I'll talk a little bit more about it after. I te timatanga ko te hia hia, mai te hia hia ko te maara, mai te maara ko te wakaro ka pute ko te kupu e. In the beginning was the desire, from the desire came the awareness, from the awareness came the thought, then the word. So this is a pau composed by Tohunga, or expert named Te Rangi Motohia Kātini, also known as Ruka Brighton, from the Wanganui region. So this pau denotes the power of desire, awareness, thought, as well as its manifestation through words. The meanings embedded within this pau provide the thematic and contextual background for the significance, rationale, and understandings for conducting this study. So I wanted to bring these thoughts and these conceptualizations about waiata that are had in the Wanganui region into this thesis, and I wanted to bring it out through words. So I feel like this pau is particularly fitting. So my key research questions, what am I asking? So the first overall major question is, what are the relationships between the Wanganui River, Rānana Marae, and waiata, and how do they inform one another? This infers a couple of subsidiary questions, 3 secondary questions to be very exact. And the first is, how has Rānana Marae been a place for waiata previously? The second, how has the Wanganui River provided a place to learn, compose, and perform waiata? And the third, how has the well-being of the Wanganui River affected waiata composition, learning, and performance? So in my study, I have 3 key sites of research. The first is the Wanganui River, the second is Rānana Marae, which is one of my marae, and the third is waiata. So the first site of research, the Wanganui River, I wanted to highlight a quote that is taken from the Wanganui River report, and this is taken from a matua called Matu Marekura, during his testimonial, and he talks a bit about the genealogy or the wakapapa of the Wanganui River. As the people of the river, we speak of the teardrops of Ranginui, and one of the teardrops was our river. Our river is the Wanganui River. The river is the beginning for our people, from the mountain to the sea. It ties us together like the umbilical cord of the unborn child. Without that, it dies. Without that strand of life, it has no meaning. The river is ultimately our mana, our tapu, our ihi, our wihi. All these things make up what the river means to us. It is our life cord, not just because it's water, but because it's sacred water to us. So just to give a bit more of a current, I think, point of view about the current state and well-being of the Wanganui River is that it's undergone involuntary chemical pollution, chemical exposures, and then also the Tongariro power scheme, which has seen the diversion of large headwaters taken further upriver and diverted this somewhere else. And this has had a devastating ecological impact on the river and also on us as descendants of the Wanganui River. The second site of research is Rānana Marae, and this is one of my marae. So in the first picture, you can see the old meeting house. We call it Waripuni, and that Waripuni is called Huri Winawa. Huri means unsettled, and Winawa means land. So it was built in a time where our land was being confiscated. And the purpose of this Waripuni, it's actually called a Warirunanga, is for all of our people to come and meet before going to the Māori Land Court and having a strategy and plan put in place before approaching the land court. So this is taken at Kowika, which is further downstream from where Rānana currently is, so further downriver, sorry, and it's more so closer on the bank. And this was made or commissioned by Major Kemp, but we know him as Taitoko. So we have in this coloured photo is what Rānana Marae looks like today. And the Waripuni is a little bit smaller now, and it's called Te Morihu, and that was named after the Battle of Motua Island, which was in May 1864. And is also connected to Ruakaho. Ngāti Roka is one of my hapu or my sub-tribes, and it's named after her, and she is a pivotal tupuna within the Wanganui River region. So the importance and relevance of the study, and this also ties into the third side of research, which is waiata or Māori song. So this is also taken from Matu Marekura. Tribal karakia and rituals, poi, action songs, and haka all go back to the river, and to the mountains, and to the sea. We have been given a task to hold and preserve these things for our mokopuna, not for us, but for generations yet to come. We do that because if we say it's for us, the time is only short. But if we say it's for our mokopuna, then that time feels like the shadow. It starts to spread out and spread out and spread out. And when our shadow is long, we are in line with the old people and the ancestors. So I want to start heading into the methodological frameworks and approaches that I'm using in this study. One of them is Tupua Te Kawa. So Tupua Te Kawa is from the legal personhood of the Wanganui River, and you may know it as Te Awa Tupua. So there are 4 values within Tupua Te Kawa, and they are also in Te Awa Tupua. That makes sense. Okay, so they've got this legal personhood and it's got 4 values, and I'm going to use these 4 values within my methodology. So these 4 values draw on the wakatoki that I said at the beginning of my presentation, and they illuminate a Wanganui worldview. So wakatoki, is a proverbial saying. This presents the divine with their natural environment, as well as show the interconnectedness between humans and the environment. So Tupua Te Kawa is part of the Māori oral tradition, histories from the Wanganui region, that discusses the significance and whakapapa, or genealogy, of the Wanganui River. These 4 values include the following. Te Awa Tupua provides the source of spiritual and physical sustenance for tribes and sub-tribes communities of the Wanganui River. Te Awa Tupua is an indivisible living whole from the mountains to the sea, including all its physical and metaphysical elements. Tribes and sub-tribe communities of the Wanganui region have inalienable connections with Te Awa Tupua, and therefore have a responsibility to its health and well-being. Te Awa Tupua is a singular entity comprised of several elements and collaborative communities working together. So the next one, or the next methodological framework that I want to discuss today, is also eco-musicological methods. And I wanted to present a waiata. This kind of waiata is called an ore, and how this relates to, I think, the underpinning philosophies of eco-musicology. I think it cuts right to what it means to be doing eco-musicological studies currently, especially in Indigenous contexts. Kai te urunga, kai te ikinga. From your pillow you blossom forth. Hutia I Maui, held forth by Maui. Ka moroke te winawaki uta. What became dry land on shore. Ka tupu te rākau, he te mighty maku. And a tree grew to be a child for me. So this excerpt is an ore, which is a type of waiata. And it's an instructional chant. And this was composed by Te Aotarewa of Ngāti Ruaka. She is from my sub-tribe, or my hapu. She was unable to conceive her own child, and instead fashions a wakapako ko rākau, or a wooden doll, with clothing and its accessories, to fulfill the role of her child. So this ore emphasizes the relationship between peoples and place through mapping significant landmarks and places to Aotearoa. These landmarks are meant to convey an obligation of custodianship to these places for the child, or through the term tiakitanga. This can also be referred to as kai tiakitanga. So what is tiakitanga? Tiakitanga encompasses the importance of custodianship in protecting or safeguarding resources, knowledge, and the environment. Eco-musicology aligns with values within tiakitanga to help collaborate and engage with Indigenous communities, or uplift Indigenous researchers surrounding knowledge to ethically and effectively combat climate change and environmental issues through music. So this is how I'm going to be using eco-musicological methods and adapting it within the frameworks I'm currently using, which is overarching, kaupapa Māori, as well as Tupua Te Kawa, or from Te Awa Tupua, eco-musicology, and performative performance methods. So I've adapted Boyle and Waterman, the comparative approach, and you can see that I am the geographic sites, the Wanganui River and Rānana Marae. The cultural context in which I'll be doing the interviews and learning waiata is through wānanga or taurahiri. These can be looked at as semi-structured interviews, also through traditional knowledge learning social contexts. And the music that I'll be looking at is waiata, or Māori song. So the control for the study will be a site, which is Rānana Marae, and the control for this is meaning that anyone I interview has to be descended from Rānana Marae. I'll be looking at the musical changes of waiata and document the environmental changes of the Wanganui River, which includes waiata compositions, alterations in performance and pedagogy and transmission. the environmental changes over time to music, so the environmental changes through colonization and climate change that are reflected through waiata, excuse me. And I'll also be looking at environmental components influencing music. So how have the environmental changes of the Wanganui River affected waiata composition, performance and learning? How waiata influences or brings an awareness to the Wanganui River. So here you'll also see waiata and also in brackets oral taonga. That's because of my previous master's study with my sub-tribe, Ngāti Ruaka. They used the term oral taonga. They believed that waiata was always oral, but it was considered a treasure to them. So they use waiata and oral taonga interchangeably. He wiri maramatanga. So this is denotes to insight. And so through wānanga or semi-structured interviews with descendants of Rana Marae, they have identified 3 significant things that relate to 3 critical aspects of Ruruku Wakatupua Te Mana o Te Iwi o Wanganui and Ruruku Wakatupua Te Mana o Te Awatupua that underpin Te Awatupua. So these 3 themes are Te Oroko Timatanga o Te Awa o Wanganui, and this roughly is within a theme called Wakapapa or genealogy. The second theme is Ko ngā tipua kei ro wai he tupuna. The waters and the land reflect the people. And the third theme is Te pā auroa ngā te awa tupua, succession and inherited legacy. So these 3 themes highlight past, present and future aspirations of our people through the lens of waiata as well as ecomusicology. So this research that I have been doing will form a kaupapa Māori ecomusicological framework. He wiringa muka. So I wanted to leave with this quote, and it kind of again reinstates the inextricable connections between the Wanganui River and its people. So any changes to the Wanganui River, such as diversion or pollution, affects the physical, spiritual and mental state of the people, for the river and people cannot be separated. So tupua te kawa and ecomusicological methods converge through the wakatoki that I said at the start of my presentation, as it underpins Wanganui iwi customary law, which is embedded not only within the psyche of the people associated with Te Autupua, but also within legislation. The comparative approach within the ecomusicological methods can be adapted to recognise the inextricable connection between uri or descendants of Rana Marae and the Wanganui River, as well as examining the musical expressions of this relationship. And further, Māori oral tradition and histories exemplify the connections between non-human phenomena as well as humans and the environment. I would even go so far as to argue that my ancestors have been talking about their connection with music and the environment for a long time. So no reira, tēnā tātou katoa. Thank you very much for having me and for allowing me to present my doctoral research to you all. Tēnā tātou katoa.
Many thanks to Mary in absentia for such a beautiful and very informative presentation. And if anyone has questions or feedback for Mary about the presentation or about her research, please do be in touch with Brian, and Brian will be able to connect you with her. Let's move straight on to the next presentation. And by the way, our question and discussion time at the end of the session will relate then to these next 2 presentations. So I invite you for these 2 to put any questions that you might have in the chat at any time, and we can return to them during the discussion session later. Alternatively, just keep a note of them for our chat later. So this next presentation is by Genevieve Campbell, and since 2007, Genevieve has been collaborating with the Tiwi Strong Women's Group on Tiwi song practice. Genevieve is currently a Sydney University Fellow working on aspects of Tiwi song and embodied knowledge. And Genevieve's presentation is in collaboration with Tiwi song custodians, and the title is Tiwi Songs, Journeys Around Time and Place. Welcome, Genevieve.
Hi there, thanks, Kathy. I just want to make sure I am sharing my screen. Can everybody see? I can't see you now, so I hope you are seeing my...
Looks good, Genevieve.
Lovely. We'll get rid of that. Hide floating So good morning, everybody. Good evening, good afternoon, wherever you are tuning in from. I am coming to you from Wongal Lands, which is in the inner Sydney region in Australia, and I'm presenting the acknowledgement that my colleagues have asked me to provide for everybody on the screen. And I also would like to give my personal acknowledgement to custodians of culture and lands who are all around the world, and certainly in the places that we all are sitting in today. Today I'm going to be talking about the Tiwi Islands, which is, just very quickly, for those of you who don't know, right at the very top of the continent that's now called Australia. Correctly, they're really called Irara or Atuati, which just means two islands, and Tiwi means people. So in terms of connection to place, right from the very beginning, it's really important to acknowledge that there was no naming of the islands. The people were the people who lived on those islands, and it was only really in post-invasion in colonial times that the islands were given, I don't know why that's happening, I didn't change that, given a name. When I first started working with the Tiwi people, I very quickly discovered that people wanted to be in the place that the country that songs came from. And so these are just some of the photos from, it seems to be on a time frame of its own. Some of the places that the songs actually belong in, and it's taken me a very long time over the last 14 years or so to really realize what that means, further than just where particular people are custodians of, and therefore where their songs belong, but the fact that these songs themselves come from those parts of country. And so it's far deeper kind of connection than purely the custodianship of lands. Callista Cantilla has explained yoi, which is in English is called dreaming or one's totem. You inherit that from your father, and your yoi is where you were found by your father before you were born. Each person waits unborn in their country until they are found and sung by their father. Then they can be born. Then we live here and we have to look after this place. After we live, we pass on to be with the ancestors back in our country, where we continue to live in those same places we walked while we were alive. The matrilineal kinship identity is Yamanga. And this is a fascinating word because apart from being this identity and this kinship group, the word itself means life. It means one's breath. If someone has poponi yamanga, it means they have a good breath, or they breathe easy, or they are calm. And the women also use it in terms of singing well. So if you have poponi yamanga, it's having a good voice and being proud of yourself when you sing, but also in terms of quality, having a good voice. Importantly, it also means the sun and the time of day. So one of the two major kinship identity groups is also the word that's used for the day, the ness of the day, the sun, where it is placed. So people are constantly throughout the day connecting with where the sun is in terms of directional location, finding one's way through the bush, and also then the absence of that at night has further impacts on socialization and the way people look after each other, which I won't get into today because it's not part of what I'm talking about today. But it's a fascinating connection that the Yamanga is who one is, and it's also the sun and the life-giving presence of the world. So all of these voices are present at all times. The Patapui are the unyet born, but they are dreamed, and they are in song that are sung, that the songs that are sung before they are in existence in this physical presence. The Tiwi are the people living now, and the Mopididi are those who've passed on. and they are still very much heard in the trees, in the land. When the women go out, they call to country, they call to the ancestors, and the ancestors speak back to them in the voices of the trees and in the voices of the animals, especially the totems that are dreaming totems, that people hear their ancestors speaking back to them in animal voice. So in the context, just quickly, of listening to song, and especially in my case, the work I do in recording of song, people hear unborn people through the voice of a father because they know that has been sung in that song, regardless of whether the person is alive or not. So when people are listening to recordings of people who, whether they're still alive or whether they're now departed, they are also hearing the unborn voices of the people who then became their descendants. And also in the case of deceased people, those who are passed away are in the present again when their voices are heard manifested in those recordings. It's far more a presence than it is an item of history. Recordings are very much seen as part of the circular sense of time. So that's just a small snippet of Callista Cantilla singing in at the Kulama, which is the ceremony, one of the annual ceremonies that happens on the Tiwi Islands. And this ceremony, it's interesting listening to the last presentation, similar effect of the environment. The Kulama is more and more seldom held because the seasons are being changed around, and it's becoming more and more difficult to schedule the ceremony. I know I'll get to that a bit later, but this song in particular is something that's sung whenever people gather, and it's sung in slightly different words because whoever sings uses their own words, but it's always an acknowledgement of country, if you like, but it's more than that. It's an actual speaking to those who are part of the country. Just looking at a few song texts, you'll see that in the English translations there, they are all manifesting the totem, if you like, the dreaming, the yoi of the person who's singing as the ancestor. So it's not speaking about a crocodile, it's that I am the crocodile as I am here singing. The turtle's eggs are my daughters. There's no third person negotiation between, separation, I should say, between the totem and the singer. It's very much that they are those ancestors, and every living custodian of crocodile, yoi for instance, is a manifestation of that ancestor when they are singing. So it's very important that songs are performed and also when they're spoken about, that they are acknowledging the land that those animals live in. And so a number of times, for instance, women will go to this particular beach, which is on the southeast corner of Bathurst Island, when they sing a particular tribe of crocodile songs. They don't get too close, of course. You wouldn't want to go past that darker line because the crocs might actually come up. But I think this next song is something I'd like to speak to a little bit more closely. This is a song that was recorded in 1975 by Charles Osborne. Now, Romuald was singing at a smoking ceremony, which is a part of healing, before the final ceremony for someone who had passed away through the seasons ago, a year ago. I am the swampy water tells the listener far more than just I am the swampy water. It tells the listener that the singer is the water, is the lifeblood, in this case, as the maternal uncle of the deceased. I'm going to have to pause. My computer is doing it again. I don't know how to stop it doing that. I am the ancestor of that land, and therefore listeners hear that I am goose dreaming because there's a particular area of swampy water that the people speak about as being, and they know that's where the goose lives. As maternal uncle, Romuald was singing as classificatory mother. So he sings in symbolism of breast milk, of nurturing. So I am the water that nurtures the country, that feeds the country. I am therefore the country that fed you when you were alive. I'll leave you to read this yourself. Natural, normal, it came from them, the ancestors. They made their own melodies. You know how they perform dancing in Kalama. They make up their own tune, maybe from the bush, wherever they're sitting alone, listening maybe, hearing the breeze, the sound of the winds, the birds, bush animals, and they reflect themselves where they're singing. So Francis and Mulika Orstow were explaining here where the actual melodies come from. Further than the text, it's the melodies that come from literally the bush. It's not mimetic in terms of bird sounds or animal sounds. It's the sounds of the land, the sounds of the country, and nobody ever speaks of the melodies having been composed by any particular singer. The words are composed by singers, but the melodies themselves fundamentally come from the ground. They come from the oceans. They come from the breeze. And I've never heard anyone describe that in any other way. It's very much the core of the land is where these melodies are coming from. I'm going to play for you the sound of the Bushstone Curlier, which lives up on the Tiwi Islands. She is the ancestral woman who was the first mother who lost a child, and her grieving husband decided that mortality then came onto the earth. Every evening when Bima, the stone curlew, cries, the women cry back to her. Now I can't get it. So the Kae Kae is in a number of grieving songs, and it's sung by women in particular, as I said, out in the bush during the evening, but it's also the absolute core part of the widow grieving song. And that motif comes through in many, many songs, and it's a direct dialogue, if you like, with this bird that is in the bush in the evenings. Oops, that's not right. Singing and dancing, of course, is connecting people with the ground. Just very quickly, I wanted to show you this. Obviously, on the right here, we have some crocodile tracks that I was slightly concerned to be photographing, as I was told that was her. She was on her way out to sea, and she was coming back in later on. But my friend here, who I can't name because she's actually passed away, but she appears here with the permission of family. She was dancing crocodile. This is only a year ago, and you'll see very much that she's actually creating the tracks with her heels in the ground. So when she and the other crocodile women are dancing, they are fundamentally manifesting into their bodies and down back into the ground and making these tracks as the crocodile. They're not pretending to be a crocodile. They are the current embodiment of their ancestor. And so this connection with the environment then and with the land or the country around them is very much one of personal survival, if you like, rather than looking after the land on behalf of the birds and animals. They are responsible for the land in terms of their own being.
Genevieve, this is Kathy. I'm afraid we're out of time. If you'd be happy to go to your concluding slide.
Yes, definitely.
Thanks.
I'm just going to finish with Callista, who was trying to explain why the town needed a culture centre. And this is my last slide. I wanted to finish with this because she, for her, the explanation of why the town needed a cultural centre is because of who people are.
Cooperation Centre. Say it again. Milimbuka Cultural Centre.
And why is it important to have that? Tell me why it's so important.
Because all of us today, from young and old, when that circle ceremony starts, we're all in that Milimbuka dancing. Anything. Tirakapai, Chocolpal, Tatawali, Rainbow, Buffalo, Rainbow, Pulaga, Ambiji, Chocolpal.
Oh, no, sorry. That was me trying to finish it off. Thank you very much. Something funny's gone on there, but I apologise, but I hope I'll just get rid of that. I don't know why my computer did that. Anyway, thank you.
Thank you very much, Genevieve. That was a very rich presentation, and looking forward to the opportunity to discuss in just a few minutes. I see Robert has already posted a question for you there, which we'll come back to. Let's move straight on to our third and final presentation in this session. It's by Georgia Curran and Enid Nangala Gallagher. So Georgia is a research fellow at the University of Sydney who has been carrying out research with the Warlpiri people since 2005. And Enid Nangala Gallagher is a senior Warlpiri woman from the Yundamu community in Central Australia. Enid's a senior cultural advisor for the Warlpiri Youth Development Aboriginal Corporation and a founder and leader of arts initiatives with and for her community. And Georgia and Enid's paper is called Place-Based Songs and New Performance Spaces, Warlpiri Women's Yawulyu. And I believe Georgia and Enid have pre-recorded their presentation just to ensure technical smoothness, but they're with us and will join us for question and discussion straight after their video. Thank you, Georgia.
Can everyone? Yeah, okay, great.
Looking good, Georgia. Thank you.
Traditional Aboriginal and Warlpiri people and pay our respects to our past, present and future. For Warlpiri people who live in the Tanami Desert community of Central Australia, songs and ceremonial practices, like many other musical traditions, are deeply valued aspects of cultural heritage. The ethnographic literature from across Central Australia depicts the remote dwelling, small-scale, kin-based worlds of Warlpiri people and puts emphasis on traditional genres of song as valued for their religious importance in linking people to dreamings and the land. For Warlpiri people, songs are valued as they maintain the relational networks between people, country, kin, and other non-human entities.
Iya la de muro na wala jana. Jadi jan no klam pemri jan klam kan pura jan chokor ba. You want to color in for the yaw will unrelated to Vaginal in Berniano. Chupo. That is in Banjani. Chup, what did you can say? What did you come in Banjan? Chupa, young as you cut for a janet. Yo, young as you cut in Banjani. Chupa, so you will name ye. There for another murder put one when a war on the Yudumla, on the Yudumwana, water to the Muro water javan, Mulakan than a tiny Janora, Warani, and Glamora, Charwood, and Glamora, Chadden, and Glamora, and Wundamalo.
As Barbara Napanunka Martin explains, a song is just about country. It's about a place with stories and a spirit, and it connects us to people in other places. In our paper today, we explore the ways in which Warlpiri groups, particularly female Yawalgu singers and dancers, take up opportunities to perform in locations outside of Warlpiri country. We will present 3 short video clips of Yawalgu singers and dancers who have travelled outside of Warlpiri country to perform their songs and dances for broader intercultural audiences. We consider the various motivations for doing so and the ways in which this has shifted over recent decades, and the important cultural work that has been done in these moments. Ethnographic literature from across Central Australia documents a Warlpiri intercultural history going back to the beginnings of the region's pastoral industry in the 1880s. Here we have some hints as to the rich history of ceremonial trade and exchange across a broad area of Central Australia. Many elders today can also reflect on past trading of ceremonies and can give extensive oral histories of the places and Aboriginal groups involved in these social networks to time depths well beyond their own memories. Substantive collections of song recordings also exist in archives, including IAXIS and the Yuendamu-based Warlpiri Media Archive, and other individual collections. These demonstrate that Warlpiri people have travelled widely for ceremonies for at least the last 7 decades and likely much longer. Françoise Dussart has traced Warlpiri performative priorities over several decades, noting distinct shifts away from traditional systems of exchange towards presentational modes that forge connections to non-Indigenous and inter-Indigenous audiences. Through these shifts, ceremonial singing remains potent in Warlpiri lives as a modern form of cultural production, and a context in which traditionalised notions of Warlpiri connections to places are maintained, rejuvenated and shared. While ceremonial songs are embedded in places, their performance contexts are rarely located at the sites focal to the songs, instead being held mostly in distant settlements, outstations, bush sites, towns, and increasingly further afield in larger Australian and international cities. The examples that we will show you in a moment illustrate that performance of songs in inter-Indigenous and intercultural contexts are key forums in which to activate and strengthen place-based identity. So now we will show you the short video clips taken of performances of Yawalgu by groups of Warlpiri women from all 3 of the trips were instigated and led by Enid, who has sought out these opportunities through her connections to arts organisations and universities across Australia. A group of Warlpiri women travelled to the Burrunga Festival in July 2018 to perform their Jalliwanpa Yawalgu to an audience of other Indigenous peoples, mostly from across the Northern Territory, but also other visitors from further afield. The Jadiwanpa songline follows the journey of an ancestral taipan snake northwards through Walpri country, encountering other ancestral beings, including the Willatiti Inu, who is depicted by the soul dancer, who comes into view in the second half of the video clip. These dancers have important relational connections to these ancestors, and through embodying them through dance, they maintain the links between different Walpri groups and showcase them to a broader audience. A group of 16 Walpri men and women travelled to Canberra to review collections of Walpri recordings that are housed at the IATSA Sound Archive. During this visit, they performed at the Aboriginal Tent Embassy, and we saw another performance that was done at this time by Otto earlier. For the women, they performed a song called Yalpurulangu, specifically chosen as it is distinct in bringing together two different kinship groups from across the desert. The related story emphasising the relationships between two aged brothers who had been initiated together through ceremony, forming lifelong connections.
Was about two aged brothers. One came from the west called Minamina. Another one came from Nantia, Kudula, from the east. And he was staying there in his country, Kudula. While the other two who was coming from the west were coming to visit him. From Minamina. So this dance is called Yalpurulanga, two aged brothers. The dance that we did today. From each country. And it represents dreaming from our father's dreaming, not mother. Father's father and father, our fathers. So that story is telling us sometimes two age brothers meeting each other and asking each other and asking, why are you here? And the other two we were dancing from the west said, we come to visit you. But the one who was staying there said, why did you come? We came to visit you. Because he was his age brother. From Minamina and from Pudulo. Yep.
In September 2018, a group of Walpri women were invited by a community arts organisation to perform Hayawalu, their women's rain songs, as part of a broader community arts event at the Alice Springs Desert Park. With images of their country projected onto the cloth screen behind them, they danced for an intercultural audience on a stage which was part of a promenade performance in which the audience walked through the Alice Springs Desert Park to 7 different stages, each with a performance by another group, all around the theme of water. This was a powerful assertion from Walpri women of their place-based identity in front of the Aranda owners of Alice Springs and the broader intercultural audience who enjoyed this as a theatrical spectacle.
We brought our dancers to show Ngapa screaming, Chukapa, the water screaming. It's screaming a travel across the country. It is our father, grandfathers, Chukapa that we follow. If you're lost in the desert, there is Ngapa that traveled all the way underground. They make water holes, salvages that you can find in Ngapa. And also you can sing to it. And the Ngapa comes. We do Ngapa Chukapa ceremonies. We take it out to push, do it with young girls. We teach them. It is strong story. It's really interesting that we look what other performers that are doing it, the dance. It's different to us. Yeah, it's really interesting that we all get together and do upper trip.
With consideration of the significant political, cultural, economic and technological changes within the Walpri region in recent decades, it is important for Walpri people to represent the relevance of their unique ways of life to broader Australia and the globe. Of particular influence is the rapidly advancing technology which eases social connectivity across the globe, but in a much altered and less intimate form to the kinds of sociality that Walpri people have with their kin. These technological advances assist Walpri people to engage with other Indigenous groups whose ways of life and political struggles are often familiar. Additionally, there have been significant social shifts in the last 10 to 15 years, such that Walpri people, although committed to residing predominantly in their remotely located settlements across Central Australia, are aspiring to engage with people from across the world. In the words of Stephen Jumpy Jimper Patrick, the creative director of the Milpri Festival, these performances are a way to make Chukurpa, dreamings, relevant to the 21st century future. Thank you for listening to our presentation, and we welcome any questions that you have.
Thank you so much, Georgia and Enid, for a wonderful presentation, and indeed to all three presenters and collaborators this morning for a very rich and thought-provoking session. I think we've got time perhaps just for a couple of questions. Maybe let's start with one each for each of the presentations, Genevieve and Georgia and Enid. I'd invite you to type your questions into the chat perhaps, just to help us to keep to time. So maybe I could start with Robert's earlier question to Genevieve then. So Genevieve, Robert asks, could you please describe how a melodic motive is identified and extracted from the environmental sound? You're just on mute, Genevieve.
Always have to do that once. Yeah, I can't actually see you on my screen, Robert, but the answer is not really, no. There are no specific melodic motives that apply to specific environmental sounds. And indeed, you know, transcribing them obviously is only something that I've started doing, but it's more that people speak about having heard the melody. Then the melodies, for a start, are all very old melodies. So there are a number of melodies that belong to particular country kinship groups, and they are sung by those groups, but there's no sort of direct association with that sounds like crocodile, or that sounds like, you know, there's no mimetic element to it, and indeed it's more the way people it's more, I don't want to sound kind of vague, but it's more of a feeling. People say that is where those melodies live, that is where those melodies reside, that is where they came from, and we hear them in the trees, we hear them in the land. Sorry, I can't really give you a specific answer to that question.
Thank you, Genevieve. Yeah, I wondered whether anybody might have a question for Georgia. I see nothing, I think, come through in the chat, but if anybody would prefer to just unmute yourselves and speak, that would be fine. I can't see any hands up. Yes. So thank you, Masaya. So Masaya says thank you to both presenters, and the similarities between the musical cosmologies or views of Tiwi and Warlpiri. But Masaya is also wondering if there are any differences in their interpretations of music in the world. Maybe Georgia, on your having seen the presentation by Genevieve, I wonder whether you might like to respond to any differences that struck you between the Warlpiri people and those of the Tiwi Islands.
Yeah, yes, I agree. There were lots of similarities through in those two presentations. I was particularly struck by the importance of the melody as something very intrinsic that's, you know, coming from the land and as part of the song. And I think probably a key difference I noted, Genevieve was saying the words are adapted, where the melodies are quite solid, whereas the words are adapted, which is not something that Warlpiri singers would say themselves, although of course they do shift over time sort of naturally. But I think the aim is to be repeating them the way that they were heard the last time that those songs were sung. And I guess probably another big difference between those two, between Tiwi and Warlpiri, is their location. And in a conference like this with, so many people from across Oceania, it's very interesting thinking about the desert as part of all of that. And I think Orme Gallagher, when she was explaining about the Ngapa Jukurpa and it connecting people, this is the rain that connects everyone, is very much underground, whereas it's not in other places, but there's still those connections to other parts of Australia that are much more coastal through the song lines that often follow those waterways which go underground. But clearly the importance of water for life is something that's shared by lots of different people. Really in a symposium like this. I think there would, I don't know, Tiwi music as well as Genevieve, obviously there'd be clear in the kinds of ceremonies held. There's probably less of an emphasis on death. I've noticed with a lot of Genevieve's work that this is a key forum when ceremonies are held and songs are sung, is around funerals and death, which sounds quite different in the desert as well, because they're mostly sung in other contexts, and there's very few songs that are held for funerals these days at all.
Thank you very much, Georgia. Sadly, I feel that I should wind up the formal part of this session, keeping an eye on time and knowing what a tight schedule there is for the rest of the day. But I know that we do have a few minutes before, I think, Brian, before the start of the next session. So maybe if anybody would like to continue the informal conversation just in these next few minutes, that would be possible as well with Georgia and with Genevieve. So I'd like to thank then all three presenters, or all the presenters of all three sessions, I should say, Mary and Georgina and Enid, and also Genevieve and her Tiwi collaborators. It was a beautiful session, a beautiful opening to the day, I think. It's been my privilege to chair. So back over to you, Brian, and all best wishes for the rest of the symposium.
Thanks, Kathy.
Kia ora. Thanks so much, Kathy. I just wanted to say that I thought that was a really excellent session. Thanks to Kathy, Mary, Genevieve, Enid, and Georgia for just a really wonderful presentation. So timely. There's such a growth in current work in place, environment, and ethnomusicology, and it's wonderful to see these contemporary perspectives. And I thought there was so much resonance between these three papers. So I'm just looking forward to seeing how these projects develop. So just thank you all. It's a really excellent session. Just checking time. It is time for us to move to the second session for today. And for this session, this session we put together is actually one that is a holdover from 2020, of course, and the 100th birthday celebration for Barbara Smith, who is here with us. And it's my great pleasure to introduce the chair of this session, Adrian Kepler, who perhaps does not need introduction. Many of us know Adrian. And thank you for being here, Adrian. Adrian, of course, is curator of oceanic ethnology at the Smithsonian Institution in Washington, D.C. She's a former president of ICTM, and of course, a long-term member of this organization, the Oceania Study Group. Thank you so much, Adrian, for chairing this session.
And thank you, Brian. Greetings to everyone from Washington, D.C., where it is just becoming spring. So you're probably having the opposite change down under. Now, welcome to this session on the legacies of Barbara Barnard Smith to music in Micronesia. And I'd just like to note that this is a very good day for this session, because it is the 10th of the month. And that means today is the birthday, 100 years and 10 months for Barbara Smith. So aloha, Barbara. Happy birthday. Good. Now, we have 3 papers in this session as well, all on Micronesia, and all using the legacy of Barbara Smith's recordings. And after the 3 papers, we'd like to ask Barbara if she'd like to make some comments and give us her thoughts on the use of her recordings now 50 years later, 5 decades afterwards. So welcome to this session. And our first paper is by Birgit Abels and Simeon. Simeon, what is your last name? Yes, Adelbai, right. And Birgit is actually she's professor at the Georg Augustus University in Göttingen, Germany. And Simeon is a media specialist, and he is at the Palau Museum. And they're going to tell us about stories untold and the music that was recorded by Barbara Smith from Palau. So take it away, whoever is going to give the paper.
Good afternoon. Simeon and I wish we could be there with you, but we're not. So we decided we'd pre-record this presentation. It's March 30th. Simeon is recording from Curran, Palau, and me, I'm recording from Göttingen in Germany. Barbara Smith needs absolutely no introduction. Her deep appreciation of Pacific Islander music and dance has made her a pioneer in more than one way. She first introduced the study of the music and dance of Asia and the Pacific Island world to the University of Hawaii at Manoa. And for what is now more than half a century, she has supported so many of us who do scholarly work on music and dance on the islands. As one of my Honolulu colleagues said to me some 15 years ago, and that too, by the way, was during an ICTM meeting in Honolulu, in a sense, Barbara is the mother of us all. But Barbara has also systematically extended her support to cultural institutions across the Pacific Island world, and the legacy of that part of her work has had a huge impact as well. She changed institutional structures, made invaluable sound recordings, fostered cultural awareness and appreciation, and time and again, she brought people together. She made sure she would repatriate her recordings long before people even called it repatriation, and I believe Brian will address that part of her legacy in his contribution to our panel.
But for many people, especially in Micronesia, incredible value also lies in many small and not so small personal stories that her recordings give access to. For today's brief presentation, we have picked one of those many stories. Our aim is to show how a single recording can offer a historical micro-narrative, and to suggest that apart from everything else, a part of Barbara's legacy is also that her recordings allow us access to stories untold. I work at Palau National Museum while Birgit is a music scholar based in Europe. If I recall correctly, Birgit and I discussed Barbara's recordings the very first time we met in Koror. That was in the early 2000s. Since then, the recordings have made our paths cross regularly, and they have also crossed our individual paths time and again. It was in the late 1963 that Barbara traveled to a number of islands in what back then was the United Nations Trust Territory of the Pacific Islands. A few years earlier, in 1959, a Micronesian club of Honolulu, a club of students studying at the University of Hawaii on Trust Territory scholarship, had first asked her for support in organizing cultural events, and then later on to become their club's advisor. In the late spring of 1963, one of the club members came to Barbara and shared his fears with her. Fears about what he perceived as rapid cultural transformation and loss of indigenous knowledge on the islands. He asked Barbara to go to Micronesia to see what she could find in terms of traditional performing arts. In a memorandum to Palau National Museum, Barbara recalls how his sincerity and sense of urgency were so compelling that I changed the plans I had made for my fall semester sabbatical leave, and I went to Micronesia. That trip was going to bring Barbara to a number of Micronesian islands, including Palau, and it resulted in a set of well-documented sound recordings. In the early 2000s, Barbara had her materials transferred to digital formats. At the time, I was media manager of Palau National Museum, and I got to digitize Barbara's color slides. Brian Dietrich, then a doctoral student in ethnomusicology at the University of Hawaii, digitized and edited Barbara's tape recordings. The digitized Barbara Smith collection of Palauan recordings include 6 CDs with Barbara's tape recordings and 3 CDs with dubbings given to her by the Palauan radio station WSCB Palau. This collection is stored in the Pacific Collection of the University of Hawaii at Manoa, USA. A copy is held by the Palau National Museum, Koror, Palau. In 2015, the Berlin Phonogram Archive remastered and published 20 of Barbara's Palauan recordings. Barbara's own Palauan recordings include invaluable documents of historical performance practices, and a number of them have been analyzed in a number of scholarly publications. What Barbara didn't know back in 1963 was that those dubbings she was given by the Palau radio station too were going to become invaluable. During political unrest in 1981, the Palauan President's office and Palau's radio stations were firebombed. The entire audio collection was destroyed. Barbara's dubbings were the only part of the station audio collections that survived. Among Barbara's own recordings are also a number of popular songs. One of them is Kula Ngarmamla, a point of Ngarmamla Island.
Marcel Movado, la minami, el malik me rabula jami, ala olbalu al gegede, eleng baral dilak langit para el mora mabe asil jadi wangaral moaragaban makmum dina wal tila oi era la ol mawadula pulagarama Adivil jetal village al gabjargen gol mor gelta edia velta madesteri e vai go klo ai sai zelvela lobo adobera on azali leng momadida langalago monasigo moeva rago garaga weng medingale raulo Madil ke arong elasil sengaga mawanorai ratabata el mengarengi kla oiloli magi ngale del ngara oregi Mengarengi kla oilo
You've recognized the song. The original tune was composed by the last Queen of Hawaii, Liliuokalani, in 1877, and it bears resemblances with several European and American melodies popular at the time. Aloha He is arguably the most iconic Hawaiian tune, carrying global recognizability as an emblem of Polynesian Pacific Islanderness. The song became even more popular all around the world when Elvis performed it as part of the movie Blue Hawaii in 1961. This particular Palauan adaptation was performed by the string band The Friday Night Club, and it uses an adjusted melody and a Palauan text. In 1936, Japanese anthropologist Iwakishi Muranushi had already recorded another version of the song in Palau. While his recording bears a clear resemblance with Aloha He too, its tune is equally clearly different from Wakulan Kedamame, the Palauan version we listened to earlier. There are several recordings of local versions of the song from across Micronesia dating from the 1930s. In her appraisal of Muranushi's work, anthropologist Elizabeth Tater considers the song's wide distribution and adaptation perhaps not as surprising as it may seem, since several missionaries to the area came from Hawaii. Regardless of how exactly the tune arrived in Micronesia, its ongoing journey across the Pacific Ocean and musical metamorphoses attest to its meaningfulness for the region. Barbara's recording shows how the Friday Night Club added a distinct sense of Palauanness to that meaningfulness.
Tatar, assessing the early recordings and their contextual framework in the 1930s, refers to U.S. American Christian missions and a quasi-colonial framework as constitutive of the song's general popularity in the larger region. Muranushi, who had collected recordings Tatar discusses, considered his recordings as belonging to the genre of Drabasi, as did Jungo Gonishi, with reference to Oreki, another version of same song still current in the second decade of 21st century. Drabasi belongs to what is called the Peesa Elitak in Palau, new music, and that often the term Peesa Elitak is translated as popular music. In any case, Peesa Elitak originated out of the colonial encounter and the music that came with that encounter. Drabasi specifically refers to a group of songs set to Palauan lyrics and based on a non-Palauan tune of either Japanese origin or in Japanese-like style. Like Kulangar Mamla, many Drabasi were based on U.S. tunes with recognizably Japanese twist, for instance, a mostly pentatonic melodic framework. Both Muranushi and Konishi work with local collaborators, and their usage of the term Drabasi reflects the local categorization of the songs they recorded. Drabasi belong to a specific historical context and speak of the historical relationship involving both Japan and the United States of America. At the same time, like many Drabasi do, the lyrics of Kulangar Mamla Oreki reference Palauan places.
This is why the Drabasi are standard repertoire until today, because in bringing together these divergent frameworks, they tie together the bits and pieces that will then make up the layered complexity of the genre. The Drabasi's genre conventions, including the flexibility inherent in them and the many musical references they carry, are capable of working all those musical ties into a lived experience and shared feeling that resonate well in contemporary Palau. Barbara's recording captures a Palauan cover version of Aloha He that is so much more than a nod to Polynesia. On that October night in 1963, when the Friday Night Club performed and Barbara recorded, Wakulan Kedamame brought together conflicting loyalties resulting from colonial history, contradictory allegiances and aspirations that bind Palauans to both their post-colonial islands and globalized networks, and the ambiguous, sometimes painful truths contained in collective and generational colonial memory. Coming together in Wakulan Kedamame, none of these conflicts were resolved, yet they made utter if vague sense. They all belonged. And here, the medium-specific logic of music making aligns with Epeli Hau'ofa's well-known dictum about the ocean as a passageway. Like the ocean, music making is not so much about boundaries as it is about connection. Wakulan Kedamame offers a glimpse into the situational relationality of that October night and into the history of that relationality. Barbara's recording also points to the interlacing of Japanese, US, and Pan-Pacific ties. It does so through the melody's primary derivation from the Hawaiian Islands, its connection with US culture and circulation within the trust territory of the Pacific Islands, and its adjustment compared to Liliuokalani's original composition to the Rebe Seal's quasi-Japanese melodic conventions. While these are all geographical references, they act as temporal markers at the same time. All members of the Friday Night Club had lived through the Japanese period between the two world wars with its exposure to Japanese language, culture, and schooling. Their life histories were imbricated with the Japanese-Palauan colonial encounter, analogous to the US-American presence on the islands after World War II. Bukulngere Mama makes these post-colonial connections heard, bringing together the temporal, spatial, emotional, and social aspects of that positionality in musical experience. In the logic of sound experience, the felt and the thought are not necessarily two separate categories. In music, one may instantaneously become the other, just like material sound waves become an affect, an emotion, or an atmosphere. This is why music is a cultural practice, transforming sound into meaningful lived experience. It is also how music acts as a passageway. It enables reconnection, recreation, and reimagination through a sound-based epistemology. In Barbara's recording of Bukulngere Mama, the seemingly disparate bits and pieces of post-colonial life in Palau come together, and they add up to a meaningful whole.
And thank you very much. This is great. Absolutely. Did I turn off my, is my microphone on?
Yes, you're good, Adrian.
Good. Okay, good. Thank you so much to Birgit and Simeon. And I must say, I love that recording of Aloha. It's beautiful. Now, they made some inferences that are going to be probably picked up in our next paper, which is by Junko Konishi. We all probably know Junko. She's at the Okinawan Prefecture University of the Arts, where she's a professor. And she's going to talk to us about the Japanese precursors of Barbara Smith and Osamu Yamaguchi. And if Osamu is out there, let's say hello to Osamu. Good. So please, Junko, you are ready to carry on.
Thank you very much. Can you hear my voice?
I can hear you and I can see you.
Thank you very much, Adrian. And hello, everyone. Thank you very much for listening to my presentation today. So I'm going to review mainly Hisautanabe's work, especially his recording of Micronesian dance and music applying to SECI spiral model and evaluate him as a precursor of Barbara Smith and Osamu Yamaguchi. I'd like to share my PowerPoint. Okay, can you see my PowerPoint? Okay.
Yes.
So this is my outline of this presentation. First, I'd like to locate Hisautanabe in the history of Japanese musicology. Then I mention his life history and his work. After referring to a recent review of Tanabe's work by Japanese scholars, I will explain SECI spiral model and musical knowledge. And then Tanabe's work, especially recorded materials of his field survey in Micronesia, are analyzed. Iwakichi Muranishi's recording that Birgit referred to is mentioned very shortly and concluded the presentation. The first section. The modern period of Japan started with a major restoration in 1868. In the same time, Kaisei Dako, an institution for studying and educating Western learning, was established to adapt Western science and culture. Rokushiro Uehara, who entered the institution in 1869 and studied the scale of traditional Japanese music scientifically, because one of the first generation of the Japanese musicologists. In 1877, unifying Kaisei Gakko and Tokyo Medical School, Tokyo Imperial University was established, and then in 1886, a physics department was established under the Faculty of Science. One of the first graduate of physics department, Shohei Tanaka, is known as his constitution of pure intonation organ. He studied in Berlin in 1884 with Hermann von Helmholtz. In this way, musicology in Japan had been formed as scientific research on sound being aimed to catch up with the Western science. Hisautanabe is the second generation of Uehara and Tanaka. Hisautanabe was a scientist, scholar, and performer of both Western and Japanese music and dance. He adopted ethnological, comparative musicological, sociological, historical, and scientific methodology to establish a history of Oriental music. He was awarded the Japanese Imperial Academy Prize in 1929. He wrote many articles, books, and collected materials. I had Barbara Smith met him, so I'd like to ask Barbara comments on the Tanabe later. Tanabe's works have received various attention in these 20 years. For example, Atsuge and Uemura refers to Tanabe in the Asian book in 1996. This was published more than 40 years after Tanabe's followers, Shigeo Kishibe and Ryoichi Taki, published the Oriental music history books. Next, in his article in 1998, Hosokawa criticized Tanabe's colonial context of Orient. Following to Hosokawa, Uemura and Yamamoto criticized researches in colonial Taiwan and Korea. Endo refers to the name of Tanabe as the first president of the Society of Research in Asiatic Music in 2017. And Suzuki's recent books focus on Tanabe's contribution for establishing Japanese court music gagaku. The only article related to Tanabe's Micronesian research is Ishimura's. I will introduce this later. So now in this presentation, I would like to refer to SECI spiral model by Nonaka and Takeuchi to evaluate Tanabe's musical knowledge as a precursor of Barbara Smith and Osamu Yamaguchi. SECI metrics of knowledge conversion is cited by authors of various disciplines. Recently, Nonaka and Takeuchi added to time dimension to emphasize ontological dimension and present SECI spiral model as here. This approach is to sustainable creation, expansion, and practice of musical knowledge. Applying to this, the musical knowledge also expands to the horizontal dimension and move to action that improves its quantity and quality. As many persons participate in creating and participate in musical knowledge, it is expanded to the vertical dimension and goes up to the spiral ontological dimension. As a result, community of creating and practicing musical knowledge develops. This could be applied to this study group. Now, I'd like to turn to Tanabe's life and works to apply the model. Hisautanabe was born in 1883 and started playing the violin when he was 14 years old. In 19th, he entered the first high school in Tokyo, where he was influenced by three knowledgeable pianists of Western music. Then Tanabe entered the physics department, science faculty of Tokyo Imperial University. He was ambitious to establish the musical acoustics and introduce Carl Schaeffer theory. And at the same time, he entered a special course of Tokyo Music School as a violinist. He published a Western music book and acoustic books. While he was learning, he found that the best way to be a musical theorist is learning the theory as well as music practice. In other words, he noticed that the musicologist is required both explicit and tacit knowledge. In this sense, while he was a forerunner of ethnomusicologists who study music theory while practicing music. At first, I'd like to mention Barbara Smith's name here as one of the pioneers of ethnomusicological study. In 1907, advised by Hantaro Nagaoka and Seiji Nakamura, Tanabe extended his research object and practices to Japanese music. Winning victories in the Sino-Japanese War and the Russo-Japanese War, Japanese scientists may have turned their interest to their own culture. Tanabe's research object, Gakuritsuron, is a Japanese and Chinese music theory on temperament that has long history since the 8th century. A music researcher, Suzuki, regards Tanabe's study on Gakuritsuron as a connection of Shohei Tanaka's pure intonation with the East Asian tuning theory. On the other hand, Endo criticizes that the Tanabe's themes of research is based on Nakamura's are merely extensions of those of the 70s, 80s centuries. However, it can be said that Tanabe's method of scientific research was a combination of tacit knowledge of Chinese jugaku and explicit knowledge of Western science. In the mid-1910s, Tanabe contributed to establish new Japanese music with Michio Miyagi, the well-known koto player composer, and Seifu Yoshida, the shakuhachi player. Tanabe also composed and performed his own works. They created new types of composition for traditional instruments inspired by Western music forms. In other words, exchanging tacit knowledge among them, they created a new Japanese music. Miyagi also dedicated to invent a traditional musical instrument. Miyagi's 1932 performance of his work Haru no Umi with French violinist René Schumer was acclaimed. However, traditionalists criticized it. Tanabe was a great advocate of renewing Japanese music traditions. His principles of modernization was not simply Westernization. He may have been a traditionalist and a nativist, but he was no preservationist. Miyagi had instructed Barbara Smith when she visited Japan. Also, I learned Barbara Smith promoted to compose and perform contemporary Hawaiian music to UH students. So I'd like to ask Barbara comments right there. How was their tacit knowledge? Then Tanabe's book, Lecture of the Japanese Music, went a bestseller, and he was recognized as leading person of studying the Japanese music. In 1929, he was awarded the Japanese Imperial Academy Prize, then had a lecture about the history of Oriental music, which helped his field survey in Micronesia economically. Okay, I would like to go back to his field survey in Asia. I call Tanabe's research tour field survey to distinguish it from the field work based on participant observation. Even he visited the field, aim of his survey was mainly to collect objects in a limited time. In a sense, he gathered information to raise his explicit knowledge of Asian and Micronesian music and dance. The preparation in advance and arrangement by collaborators and ensured research budget were necessary. That political, ideological, and economic factors determined the geographical limit of the field to be inside the empire. Tanabe started his field research to Korea in 1921 as the first Japanese musicologist dispatched there. His purpose was to research and revive Lee Dynasty court music. Gagaku, the imperial ceremonial music, had been formed, importing the Chinese court music via Korean peninsula around the 70th and 80th centuries. However, it was mostly falling into neglect in China and Korea at the time. The following field survey in Okinawa, Yaeyama, Taiwan, and Sakhalin were motivated to discover the origin of the Japanese race and to study colonial management method for Tanabe. Researching the overseas land of Japan, Tanabe wrote many travel and research reports that made him well-known ethnomusicologist. Tanabe's field survey to Micronesia was realized in 1934. An English summary of explanation on LP record jacket translated by Emmett Richards said, his interest of the area originally developed from reading a travel guide of the area, which included an article on music and dance. However, this was not a travel guide, but a travel report, Nanyo Tanken Juki, by Keikun Suzuki, who was dispatched by the Japanese government to Marshall Island to investigate the murder case of the Japanese drifted crews in 1884. The writer Keikun Suzuki was highly evaluated for his skilled observation and writing with his sketches. However, in 1995, the archaeologist Jun Takayama found the travel report was a fake, and that Suzuki modeled the American story of wrecked of Rainier. Anyway, thanks to the support of officials of Nanyocho, Tanabe could watch the same dance as the Suzuki refers to, which is called Jabwa. Why Tanabe got the official support was that after he was awarded the Japanese Imperial Academy 1929, his relatives appreciated his research. In case of Micronesia field survey, one of his relatives, Haruji Matsue, called Sugar King in Saipan, persuaded the Director General of Nanyocho government to Tanabe be as a temporary employee. Tanabe had a negative opinion with Suzuki Keikun, who regarded Maoris as savage people in his travel book. Realizing that the islanders of Micronesia were still living in a natural style, largely untouched by civilization, Tanabe felt that their music would be in order to provide a good basis for comparison with what is known as ancient Japanese music. He wanted to visit there sooner before the extension of the dance and music, for he had heard that they were prohibited by missionaries then. The schedule of field survey is very tight. The longest stay is only 4 days. Tanabe said, thanks to the Japanese officials, Japanese private citizens and the islanders, he accomplished his field survey. Documents are collected by them prior to his arrivals, and he could also receive the additional information in his return trip. On the jacket of LP record, title or contents of songs and names of singers in Japanese and English translation and HOTS were printed with Hideo's explanation. Hideo is the son of Hisao. 16 songs were recorded in this LP. In addition, leaflet with explanation in there in Japanese by Hideo's attached. I surrounded with different colors of square to distinguish the area. Blue is Palau, green is Truk, gold is Pohnpei. Then violet is Marshall Islands. There's a lot of information about the Marshall is why Palauans is little, very small. In addition to this, 155 pages of information is on his travel book. It includes 12 Palauan pages, 14 Koshrai pages, 25 Marshall spaces, 36 Pohnpei pages, and 49 Chuukese spaces. Chuukese pages are larger than others. This is because Chuukese research was helped by the Japanese recent year, Kobe Mori. This is an example of page of Marshall's dance. In this way, Tanabe collected amount of information within a few days, staying in each island. And this is the data of Tanabe's surviving field notebook in Micronesia that was discovered in 2017. Tokyo National Research Institute for Cultural Properties received from a family member and kept the digital file. Ishimura reveals that there are very little entry about Tanabe's own investigation. However, analysis of this notebook shows that Tanabe placed importance on ethnological information for his research. Yes, Tanabe was an enthusiastic researcher. On the other hand, there are discrepancies of explanations and the contents. For example, Jepwa was the dance that Tanabe wanted to see. However, the recording is a different one. So let's see the Jabwa. Let's listen to the recording of Tanabe's. Oh, sorry, Tanabe's. As you can listen to this one, so this is a more contemporary style of dance song. Maybe some song recorded in the island of Jarut, where many people were summoned. So I'd like to introduce another example of Jabra dance performed at the Pacific Festival of Arts here. Yes, this is what Tanabe observed during his stay in Ireland. So I think the recording of Tanabe's one is a different one. Okay.
Hello, Junko. We need to finish now and move on in the session, if that's okay.
No, I'd like to return to my presentation paper, but now would you? So I'd like to show my PowerPoint now again. So slideshow. Can you see my PowerPoint again?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. So on the musicologist Suzuki also indicates that they contribute confusable which phonograph he took Micronesia, and Hisao and Hideo wrote different names who made the equipment. Today I have spent most of the time talking about Tanabe's research, so I think I have a little time to mention the Japanese anthropologist Iwakichi Muranishi's recording in 1936, which was conducted by Bishop Museum cooperating with the Saito Foundation for Museum Japan. This image is the green frame of the booklet, the cassette tape of calling of the morning bird. Which was introduced by Birgit and compiled by Elizabeth Tether in 1985 with translation by Palawan Otto and Yapis Perrin. It is surprising to see that the media attached was a cassette tape. The recording media was changed so quickly since Tanabe modified the gramophone for his field research in 1934. Not the recording equipment, but also my own research equipment was changed dramatically. I remember that I presented the paper on Call of the Morning Bird at the study group on Oceanic Group. Also, I didn't remember the year I discovered my 100th manuscript for presentation in 1995, entitled Reconsideration of Earlier Recordings as a case study of Yapi songs recorded by Muradeshi in 1936, of which English was collected by Barbara Smith. Okay, thank you.
And thank you for that, Junko. Ms. Tanabe's recordings are so important, a predecessor to Barbara Smith's work. And I'm now sharing my screen, and can everyone see that okay?
Right, thank you, Brian. I'm sorry, I had my microphone turned on. So we all know Brian. He is the organizer of this conference, as we know. He is a senior lecturer at Victoria University in Wellington. And thank you for now giving a paper for us. And Brian's paper is going to be about applied ethnomusicology, and I believe using Barbara Smith's recordings. Thank you, Brian. Please begin.
Thank you, Adrian. I hope everyone can hear me okay and see my slides.
Yes, you're fine.
Great. Thank you, Junko and Adrian and Birgit and Sim. Back in 2011, in a classroom in Chuuk in the Federated States of Micronesia, I turned to students with a prompt to listen to an old recording. From the speakers sang students from St. Cecilia's School decades before, their voices resonant and clear. The song melody reveals obvious hymn influence, but this wasn't worship, but a fishing song called Efachwa Fotun, One Paddling Canoe, which recounts many types of fish in Chuuk. By 1963, the structures of hymnody were used for any types of songs, the poetry the main determination. Listen to the example here. These voices were from a recording made half a century earlier in November 1963 on tape by American ethnomusicologist Barbara B. Smith. Listening closely to this recording in digital format during a new class I was teaching about the history of music in Chuuk, these and other voices resonated through the imaginations of the class. One student questioned what the singers wanted to communicate for us through their songs. What was the message for us listening today, she asked. In this presentation, I take this initial question from the class engagement with the 1963 recordings by Barbara Smith to discuss how those recordings were made, but also our shared listening experiences with them. I wish to examine some of the important historical and cultural features of the recordings, part of Smith's pioneering work in the region. More broadly, I ask how and if we might identify precedents in current work in applied ethnomusicology and experiences from the past, research that considers relationships as central to its practices. Over the past 20 years, ethnomusicologists have been refocusing on work that comes under the umbrella of applied ethnomusicology. According to Jeff Tighton in the Oxford Handbook of Applied Ethnomusicology, co-authored with Svanibor Patan, such work, quote, puts ethnomusicological scholarship to practical use and a music-centered intervention in a particular community, whose purpose is to benefit that community. But above all, the intervention is people-centered. It is based in the collaborative partnerships that arise, end quote. Tighton does not place a starting point on applied ethnomusicology, and numerous writers have found past precedents. In this paper, I suggest ways that Barbara Smith's work in Micronesia might be considered as one intervention, but particularly from the recorded voices themselves. My own involvement with the 1963 recordings first came as a PhD student at the University of Hawaii. In 2004, Barbara asked me to assist her in digitizing her recordings, thus beginning a long process. In addition to going through Barbara's many field notes and photos, I had the pleasure of listening to every track she recorded, and of course discussing these with her. Thus, my perspective has been one of someone with a close ear to the recorded voices themselves. The Barbara Smith collection of recordings from Micronesia is of significant historical importance. Although it is not the earliest collection from this part of the Pacific, as we've just heard, however, Smith's work was the most extensive regional collection made up to that time. The original recordings consist of 30 magnetic reels made between September 1963 and January 1964. Smith made recordings in Palau, Yap, Ulithi, Chuuk, Pohnpei, Kosraean communities on Pohnpei, and the Marshall Islands. Traveling alone, but helped by many well-known Micronesians, such as Carmen Chigi of Yap, Kintoki Joseph of Chuuk, Pensile Lawrence of Pohnpei, and many others. Smith journeyed from west to east in a hydroplane, like the one seen here, made with some difficulty in the early days of the US Trust territory of the Pacific Islands. In an interview with Jay Junker, published in 2007, Barbara dryly noted about the extraordinary flights, quote, as soon as we would land, the pilot would climb up a ladder with some baling wire and would do something with the motor that seemed important, end quote. Within each district, she traveled by small outboard boats waiting ashore with equipment. That equipment was the Nagra, one of the best portable field recorders for its day, and also 2 cameras, including a Polaroid, with which she could hand out photos taken and immediately give back to families. But why did Barbara first go to Micronesia in 1963? Smith taught in the music department at the University of Hawaii, and where a number of young Micronesians had come to Honolulu for study. She had previously worked with Micronesians as an advisor to the Micronesian Club of Honolulu and had assisted the students to produce the groundbreaking album Enchanted Evening in Micronesia in 1960. Thus, her early involvement was one of putting her skills to use for the community. Then, with prompts from young Micronesians about intergenerational knowledge in music, Smith took sabbatical in fall 1963 to make the first of what would be many trips to the region and long friendships. Upon her return in 1964, she played recorded examples with explanations to students in the Micronesian Club and at the East-West Center about her experiences, thus sparking further dialogue about Micronesian art forms. Although her interest was on traditional chant and dance, as was typical at the time in ethnomusicology, Smith's project was forward-looking, that it was communities, singers and dancers, who often decided on recording content. And thus, unlike many historical recordings in Micronesia, her work included children's songs, church music, and Christmas songs. But what is often little known is that half of Barbara's collection was also popular music. Recordings and dubbings are some of the oldest such recordings of Micronesian popular genres. In Palau, Smith spent the longest stretch of her trip and made the most recordings, as described by the first paper in this panel. On Yap, she recorded dances by elders, and in Colonia, performances by students and religious and popular secular songs. She also recorded the expansive United Nations Day celebration on 25th October with several village performances, as heard in this excerpt. Smith also traveled to the outer island atoll of Ulithi, making recordings by portable lamp of dances, songs from the Japanese period, and navigational songs. Here are a few phrases of a popular marching dance by young women of Ulithi. To the east in Chuk Lagoon, Smith visited Wona, Udot, and Uman Islands, recording stick dances, church musics, and island songs, but perhaps most provocatively, a full requiem mass sung in Latin at St. Cecilia's School with organ, and that was organized for the death of US President John F. Kennedy, who was assassinated only 2 days earlier. This soft, extraordinary recording marked local voices responding to global events at the time. Her radio dubbings are the earliest recorded Chuukese string band musics and the earliest ones to include popular songs with harmonica, such as this excerpt. To the east on Pohnpei, Smith recorded chiefs' recitations, outer island chants, a full sakau or kavas ceremony with 8 stone gongs, but also Christmas music by the Koshrayan community. On Majuro in the Marshall Islands, Smith recorded musics for Christmas, Jebua stick dances, chants for navigation, fishing, and tattoo, and the influence of Gilbertese musics. Listen here to a recording she made of John Iman and his family on 28th December, singing one of their favorite popular religious songs. 2004, Barbara and I began to work on the sound transfers and compiling catalogs of the recording contents based on her field notes. Repatriating recordings is, of course, dependent on a place to send them. In Palau, this proved easy with the Palau National Museum, as we've heard in the first presentation. In the FSM and Marshall Islands, this was more challenging, given the changing fortunes of local archives. It wasn't until June 2015 that Barbara and I met in Honolulu, and I physically carried the recordings and catalogs to Micronesia after extensive correspondences. In the Marshall Islands, Barbara deposited her collection at the Library of the College of the Marshall Islands on Majuro, where it remains part of the Pacific Collection. In the FSM, digital copies are housed at the Pacific Archives of the College of Micronesia National Campus on Pohnpei. Through a deed of gift, Barbara transferred ownership of the materials, and each institution has made them accessible to students, faculty, researchers, and the wider community. After receiving the collection, Barbara's recordings have been widely used and accessed in the region, in student projects, played on the radio, and in accompanying historical video projects, as just a few examples. In considering Barbara's 1963 recordings, I have pondered how our understanding of applied ethnomusicology might or might not intersect with her 1963 project. In a 2012 article, Landau and Fergian contend that recordings have an important role in focusing our attention on collaborative and proactive research. By examining engagements with recordings from beyond the archive, we move our research practices toward the advocacy, responsibility, and applied potential that scholars have called for. But there still remains questions of agency and power realities. And here I come back to the recorded voices. What stands out to me most in listening to Barbara's recordings is that we hear the agency of local voices. In 1963, field recordings and publication in ethnomusicology showed little interest in topics of popular and everyday musics. And it wasn't until decades later that ethnomusicologists seriously engaged with these topics. These musics are not peripheral to Barbara's collection, but indeed they were central, just as they were central to music making in Micronesia. The decision on what and who to record came at least in part from those who sang. The Requiem Mass for Kennedy was not merely a colonial situation captured in sound, it was partly that, but also represented important aesthetics to Chukis at the time. In closing, I'd like to propose that we might listen for the traces, sounds, and voices of local agency in historical recordings, what Bronwyn Douglas identifies in print as Indigenous countersigns. Barbara Smith's 1963 recording project remains of great interest in Micronesia. And listening sensitively to the voices on the other side of the tape, we might hear something of the decisions, encounters, and aesthetics that Barbara opened for us to experience today. Kia ora, and thank you very much. I also want to just give a thanks to the panelists and Adrian for this session today. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Brian. I seem to be turned off here.
We can hear you, Adrian.
You can, okay, right.
No, I just wondered, I guess we did believe that Barbara wanted to say something
Yes,
briefly.
I think that we should ask Barbara next. Barbara, are you there? It would be very nice to hear some comments from you on how your legacy has been and is being used.
Well, I do thank all three of these speakers for what they have contributed, the angles and approaches that they have used. And I want to agree wholeheartedly with Brian that I've had an application approach throughout my life. I mean, throughout my professional career as an ethnomusicologist. There was a time way back when I was trying to learn about ethnomusicology to figure out what I should be doing in Hawaii. When Alan Merriam, I was at a conference with Alan Merriam, And he said very bluntly, your students be damned. Just pay attention to your own writing. That's the only way you'll be known in the future. But in fact, see, when I was asked to give the Charles Leaguer Memorial Lecture in 1958, I thought, well, maybe I should try to make a contribution to ethnomusicology as a field. But I couldn't think of anything. And so I ended up by writing about my students at the University of Hawaii. So it's very gratifying to know that that this field is more accepted and that people are appreciating and benefiting from that kind of work through the work of others, even if some of it started from me. And so thank you very much to all of you. Thank you.
Thank you, Barbara. And you have made so many contributions. Whoever said that, who was that, Alan Merriam? Can't imagine that his contributions are remembered like yours. But of course, you have had so many students, and they will keep all of this alive. And they have kept it alive and then moved it on to their students and so forth, and it keeps going. But even better, and I think probably more important to you, is that the Indigenous people from whom you recorded this are now actually using it. And so now 50 years later, you can see and hear the people who are generations down from those you recorded actually being appreciative. And we all appreciate it. Thank you so much again.
Thank you.
Now, Brian, I think we are out of time, and I didn't see any questions come in the chat, and any that did, I couldn't separate them from greetings. So are we, do you have any other questions here that I didn't see come in?
Thank you, Adrian. Yes, well, it is time to move on, but I'll just point out that there is one question from Chi Fang, I believe, for Junko, and perhaps both of you can be in touch on chat about that, and I'll direct Junko to that question about Tanabe's recordings that's there to everyone. It is time to move on. Thank you very much, Barbara. It's really wonderful to see you here with us and have you here for this panel. So really, thank you. Thank you very much. And thank you to all the panelists and Adrian for chairing. It is time to move on to the next session, our last session for today. And I'd just like to also note that we've got a very international group of people here from so many time zones. So just wonderful looking through the list to see everyone here joining us. Thank you. For our third panel for today, I'd like to introduce the chair of that panel, and that is Kirk Sullivan. Kirk is a PhD candidate in ethnomusicology at the University of Hawaii at Manoa. His research focuses on the vocal music of the Cook Islanders, both in the islands and the diaspora. Kirk, thank you so much for leading this session.
Thank you, Brian. Aloha mai kako, and welcome to session number 5. I'll be coordinating the session of 3 presenters. Just as a reminder, we'll do 3 15-minute presentations and then hopefully have time for questions afterwards. If you have questions, please type them into the chat box for everyone. And to the presenters, I'll give a 1-minute heads up before the end of your time. So let's get started with our first presenter. Junichiro Sua has been studying Oceanian music culture with a special focus on post-colonial musical phenomena within the scope of cultural anthropology. He will be speaking today on the appropriation of indigenous musical materials in Papua New Guinean ethnopop. So welcome, Junichiro.
All right. Papua New Guinea has developed a distinctive style of ethnopop known as local sing-sing, The repertoire of local appropriates a large number of musical materials from traditional musical genre, most of which comes from the dance genre, the Sinsin Tumbuna, meaning ancestral songs. In the Medan area, where the data for this paper is obtained by ethnographical field research in 1997 and 1998, the generic form of Sinsin Tumbuna has been a post-colonial invention. The examples are taken from the power band production from Yabob village, which locates about 5 kilometers south of Medan town. This presentation is going to be a very rough sketch to discuss about the traditionalism of the Melanesian ethnopop. I'll begin with a brief introduction about this dance genre. Unfortunately, documents are scant and nothing is certain about the traditional dances in the pre-contact era. At any rate, however, some kind of singing and dancing has been existing since the pre-contact era, and the Sinsin Tumbuna today has taken an idea from these songs, if not directly transmitted. Before the Germans opened the settlement in the very early 20th century, the dance is generally called dug in the Yabub language, but more often the dance is identified by specific names. Many of them, however, have not survived the colonialism and are known today. The manuscript by Emil Hahnemann, who has stationed in Crankett Island as a Lutheran missionary in the Gedageda and the Bilu language groups north of Medan town, identified several dance forms performed either occasionally or ceremonially. Obviously, these dances mentioned in 1912 has been obsolete by the post-war era. Yabov village, the Sinsin Tumbuna performed today on an arrangement around in 1970 in order to provide a dance program for a culture event. They have appropriated the songs called Daik, which are sung by unmarried boys and girls as they hide in the bush under the moonlight to find a mate, and it's strictly taboo to them singing or sing it in any other occasions. The other tunes for the Sinsin Tumbuna originally belonged to Kanam, the dance transmitted from the Takia people of Curlier Island. Also, the archival recordings in the Radio Medan list a number of traditional dances, but none of them bears the same name as in Hahnemann's manuscript. Roughly 100 musical samples of the ethnopop known as local sing are obtained from the Yabub community of Medan province. And in the cases of power band from the 1990s, these are entirely represented by males. About a quarter of local sing using the word of Sinsin Tumbuna or other traditional materials such as children's songs, either entirely or partially. Out of the 103 tunes tunes in total, 26 of them are an arrangement from the traditional dance, most of which comes from Yabob village. The non-Yabob sources of traditional dances are learned from friends or relatives who originate from those communities. Curiously, the traditional music instruments such as the kundu drum, slit drum, and so forth are not incorporated. As I have already discussed elsewhere, the permission to appropriate the dance genre is not given from anyone. This is due to the fact that the authorship tends to be collective and ownership is likely practiced as commons by community basis. However, this does not necessarily mean absence of authorization from the musician's point of view, because the dances have been either inherited to the musicians or they are related with the community. Now, I would like to introduce a musical example. Sirori by Kale Gadagads, the band, is an arrangement of Yabob Sinsin Tumbuna. Sandy Gabriel is a composer and a vocalist. For the comparison, a field recording of the Sirori section of Sinsin Tumbuna, Mai Mai, will be played. Please excuse the quality of recording and the conversation over the performance. I'm going to play the Sirori first.
One day
Oh, sorry. Oh, sorry. Something is very wrong. I don't know how to move. Well, sorry, I something is very wrong, and I don't know how to stop this. The previous example. Whoa. I'm sorry. I'm going to move on. Wow. The artist, this is actually the word from the Sandy Garros version. The artist prefer to retain the words. The melody is not so much important except the phrasing. The lyrics are highly repetitive. It sings of barnacles called shirori sticking on the canoe, which is wag, and the outrigger, saman. Since the Yabov Islanders commute with canoe, the song takes a rather an ordinary subject. The shirori is a piece in a chain of small songs that forms a dance, the piece called Mai Mai. The locals can explain the poetics of the Sinsin Tumbuna. The first is that the words must be simple and brief. Simpler, the shorter the word, the deeper it becomes allusion. However, no one knows why barnacles had become the subject of song, since its original context of courtship song has been lost. The only vague image of the shirori today is a silhouette of canoe embarked on the beach with barnacles covering the bottom of the boat. A Yabov speaker can only guess the image of canoe as a metaphor, the putting on a new meaning of their own, despite the fact that they could not know what a canoe with barnacles would stand for exactly. And secondly, the repetition does not mean absence of image. Rather, the duration of time resulted by the resonating repetition generates a smooth density of sound space. The redundancy of repeated short words produces texture. There is no need of climax, but a plateau, and it makes the space of sound as a territory of musical activity. In fact, not only Yabov, but by and large around the coastal Medan communities, the words of the Sinsin Tumbuna are highly repetitive and even fragmental. Vocables are also quite common in a number of tunes, which consist of sequences of vowels, aye, aiwo, au, ae, eo, etc., etc. In this regard, the appropriation of the Sinsin Tumbuna in the ethnopop is not a parody of traditional culture, despite the fact that artists sometimes would show up on the stage with traditional costumes. Another point is that the word in this arrangement is by and large devoid of pathos, which is rather prevalent among string band and newly composed tunes for the power bands. The aesthetics of sore or sori in Tok-Pisin to express the deep and special feelings that were the subject, which is especially the case among the songs about love, loss, nostalgia, or longing for home, to the appropriation of Sinsin Tumbuna is, by contrast, such sense of sorry is not directly found in the words. Therefore, whether the artist play a strategy with the audience expectation remains rather nebulous and difficult to formulate. When they are asked about the intention of arrangement of Sinsin Tumbuna, they would answer categorically, it's just nice that way because it's something we've got for a long time. The genre of Sinsin-Tumbuna is characterized as highly metaphorical allusions and vocables, but it is difficult to understand them in terms of function and expression. The beat of Sirori is reggae, which is actually the case in a number of arrangements. It is not known exactly why and how the reggae is considered to suit them. In fact, these arrangements are nearly devoid of any message to communicate, and it's very different from the message-oriented lyrics common in reggae. Where the local artists never exactly point out the reason for popularity of reggae in these arrangements, the affinity between the reggae and the Sinsin-Tumbuna appears to be, one, the sense of regular pulse, which can be grouped by duple, with slight shakes produced by enunciation. Two, vocal technique that frequently employ falsetto. And three, relatively narrow dynamics in phrasing patterns. The Rasta culture of reggae might have played some role in fashioning the Melanesian artist, musically speaking. These characteristics listed above might be something to consider. The fact that reggae beat is found also in pair band renditions of old string band tunes and so forth makes the situation more complex, but at least it seems to be true that the reggae beat facilitates the bridge between the musical logic of Sinsin-Tumbuna and the reality of the pair band for the 66 nightly dance settings. The arrangement by the Kale Gadagas, the lead vocalist and composer Sandy Gabriel, that keeps the words of the Sinsin-Tumbuna but replaces the melody and beat. Here, Sandy plays his signature vibration to wailing stretched note. The vocal technique acquired a number of followers after his death, and eventually referred as Medan style by the local artist. Despite that, local discourse and commercialism tends to suggest, to conclude that the appropriation from the Sinsin-Tumbuna's work of tribal identity might be an essentialism. Traditionalism of a musical form in this case, therefore, needs a closer look, since it is a process of a musical renovation. One thing is that the electronics, which has been the vogue of PNG contemporary music, after the independence of 1975, developments in infrastructure and media networking has enabled the artists to appropriate the electronic media rather freely. Electronic musical instruments, the amplifier, as well as the radio station, the cassette, and MP3 recordings have been increasingly accessible. People have become more and more mobile within the country and overseas, and media networking has become global. These have definitely contributed upon awareness to view their surroundings from different angles. In terms of musical style, the development of acoustics freed the artist from the tonalism of string band music. In Medan area, during the ages of string band and bamboo band music, which is the time period roughly between the post-war time and a latter half of 1980s, successful rendition from the traditional music is basically non-existent. This is primarily due to the prohibition of traditional dances for public performance in the earlier phase of string band. But it is more likely, as a number of locals pointed out, it just didn't work for the Western tuning system. In addition, these Pacific tunes are considered as a sign of the modern time to the young generation at that time. The melodic line of the Sinsin-Tumbuna in the Medan area has relatively narrow interval, and the dynamics and the change of tempi is not counted for. Instead, subtle shift of contour is appreciated as the crucial element to a good performance. This contour sounds somewhat different from Sandy Gabriel's singing. However, his distinct wailing singing voice is very often compared with the Sinsin-Tumbuna. This suggests that microtonal melodic contour is an important element for what the Tok-Pisin speaker would describe as Gupala Sinsin or Igat nice vocal technique. The significance of electronics, therefore, is not limited to the copycatting of Western pop, but rather it has opened the possibility to resurrect and recontextualize the musical idioms of the Sinsin-Tumbuna. As long as the enunciation of contour remains to be significant in the singing voice, which seems to be apparent in the case of repeated words, the alteration of melody and rhythm might not be considered to be a flaw. This appropriation of Sinsin Tumbura in this regard means not a mere traditionalism or expression of collective identity, but it is the innovation of a new developmental sensibility for music, and perhaps this refrained the youth from experimenting with the traditional musical materials.
Junichiro, you need to wrap it up pretty quick here.
Okay. So I guess I'm going to skip to the conclusion then. Okay, the last flip. At one occasion, which is the funeral of a young girl who poisoned herself for a denied romance, a local lady, her relative, has got something to tell me. She said, "We cry when someone dies because we are small people. We do not live in a big place like Tokyo with a lot of people. We are small people, and where we lose someone, there the sorrow is bigger." Although her words are not directly related to anything musical, they nonetheless invoke the assemblage of arrangement from the Sinsintumbuna to local tunes. The smallness of the indigenous dance genre here generates the world of local music, and for this unintelligible enunciation has little influence to perception of music. As this case shows, analysis about the contents in the lyrics would limit the understanding of the popularity of the local songs among the Melanesian grassroots. Enunciation assembled all of them in the personhood or the face of sound experience that generates an impeccable sense of reality in the space of performance. Okay, I'm going to wrap it up here. So thanks for the listening.
Thank you very much.
I'll give it to Kirk. Thank you very much.
Thank you for giving us a little insight into P&G ethnopop. Really, really interesting. Next, we will go to our second speaker, Chun Bin Chen. As I understand it, he has provided a video. Eric, I think, do you have that queued up? Chun Bin will speak on, the title of his talk is Call and Response Between Voice and Body, the Tremilatira dance of the Pinuyu Mayan people of Taiwan. And Chun Bin, I believe, is online and will be available for questions, but we'll be watching his video. I'm sorry, I should have introduced Chun Bin. Chun Bin Chen is professor of musicology at Taipei National University of the Arts in Taiwan.
Hi, this is Chun Bin, and I'm now in Chicago. I recorded these videos in Professor Phil Bowman's office. Thanks to Phil for his office, and I'd like to send his regards to everyone. The title of this paper is Call and Response Between Voice and Body, the Demlatila Dance of the Pinuyu Mayan People, Taiwan. By examining a Taiwanese indigenous music and dance genre, I propose including Taiwan in the discourse of the oceanic performance pathways. Conventionally, the term Oceania refers to Polynesia, Melanesia, and Micronesia, sometimes coastal Australia, Aotearoa, New Zealand, Indonesian Papua, with the Papua and maritime Southeast Asia are included, but it is not applied to Taiwan. However, scholars such as Robert Blast, Gerald Diamond, and Peter Bell would have proposed that Taiwan is the homeland of all Austronesian-speaking peoples. Advocates of the out of Taiwan theory believe that the expansion of the Austronesian language family across insular Southeast Asia and Oceania began in Taiwan, and all Austronesian-speaking peoples share certain cultural characteristics aside from language. Can we find common characteristics in music of all Austronesian-speaking peoples? What can we learn from this kind of a comparison? Can we help to better understand the notion of the performance pathways? To consider these questions, I take the Demlatila chant and dance of the Pinuyu Mayan people as an example. Now I play you a video clip of the Demlatila. In this clip, you can find how an outsider ruined the dance, and you can understand why later. Before my discussion about the Damrajilao, I provide a brief description of Taiwanese indigenous peoples and highlight one of them, the Binoyumayang. On the northernmost part of the geographic region of the Austronesian language family, Taiwan was an independent territory owned by the Austronesians for about 5,000 years before Chinese immigrations in the 17th century. After multiple outside powers, the Dutch, the Chinese, and the Japanese successively ruling the island and each making impacts on the Austronesians. These indigenous peoples are now citizens of the Republic of China, constituting 2% of its population of the over 23 million. According to current governmental categorization, Taiwanese indigenous people are composed of 16 groups, namely Amis, Ataya, Bunun, Daruat, Kanakanawut, Gabalan, Baiwan, Binoyumayang, Lukai, Saishat, Sakilaya, Saijet, Sao, Trugu, So, and Yami or Dau. They live in the mountains, the east coast, and the offshore Orchid Island, although about half of indigenous populations are living in cities nowadays. There are also groups of the Austronesian-speaking peoples known as Pingpu peoples in northern east and western Taiwan, who are not legally recognized by the governments as indigenous peoples because they are considered Sinicized. Names of some settled cities derived from Austronesian terms remind the people that these places were originally Pingpu people's territory. For example, the names of the area called Mado in Tainan City is derived from Mata, namely meaning eyes, and that of the Wanhua in Taipei City is derived from Vaga, meaning canoes. The term Binoyumayang refers to an indigenous group made up of 10 villages in Taitung County in southeastern Taiwan. The 10 villages are Baburu, Tanau, Bulibulibut, Alibai, Tamalakau, Ligabong, Katatipur, Kasaragan, Pinaski, and Buyuma. Buyuma, a subgroup of the Binoyumayang, dominated other Binoyumayang villages for about 2 centuries before Japan took over Taiwan. Buyuma village was so mighty not only among the Binoyumayang villages but also in eastern Taiwan that the term Buyuma was used as the past total term to refer to the group now called Binoyumayang until this new term was proposed in recent years. These villages share the common rituals and music dance forms such as the Mana Yao, the Great Hunting Ritual, and the Damrajilao chant and dance, but each of these villages has their own ritual procedures, articulation of the ritual chants, and movements of dances. The ways Binoyumayang people perform the Damrajilao differ from village to village, and the differences are so sharp that people of the Binoyumayang village are unable to perform it together with their Binoyumayang fellows from other villages. Among the Binoyumayang villages, only peoples from Buyuma village and Baburu village can perform the Damrajilao together. And the examples in my discussion are taken from these 2 villages. Buyuma village having a population about 1,000 indigenous people, and Baburu village about 200 are often regarded as twins. They split They split from Bina Buyuma, the old Buyuma, in the 1930s when it was abandoned. But close kin relationships and cultural affinity have been maintained among members of these villages since then. The Tamarakirao only appears in formal occasions, and it is an indispensable component of Binuyumayan rituals. In the Tamarakirao, chant and dance are inseparable. The chant is not an incidental music for the dance. Rather, we may consider the chanting a call and dancers' movement the response. The chanting of the Tamarakirao and other Binuyumayan chants is based on a similar trend, parallelism in lyrics and call and response forms of singing. Although in the Tamarakirao, participants responded to the call with body movements rather than their voice. The couplets of these chants represent the principles of the parallelism by means of the alliteration and synonymous words. The following Tamarakirao couplet exemplifies the use of the synonymous words and alliteration. Sagalanda Amiyang, a happy annual event. Sagalanda Pacharan, a happy festival. Musically, a Tamarakirao stanza consists of 3 sections. Vocables are sung in the first musical section, and the 2 lines of the lyrics interspersed with vocables appeared in the second and third sections. Each musical section contains 4 phrases, and the melodic lines of the first section is repeated and elaborated in the other ones. Now I play you the first and second sections of the chant. The Tamarakirao dance is a circle dance in which male and female dancers hold hands and move counterclockwise, led by a male member in the front of the line. A set of dance movements, including crouching, jumping, and kicking, is repeated to punctuate the melodic phrases of the chant sung by a male elder standing by the dancers. The movements do not portray the lyrics of the chant, but specific meanings can be expressed through the call and response. To put it another way, the movements in the Tamarakirao dance do not tell something, but meanings can be created, conveyed, and perceived by participants in the musicking and dancing. The set of movements is repeated 4 times to respond to the code of the 3-section chant, resulting in a sense of the irregularity in the call and response between the voice and body. Because of this sense of the irregularity and because the chant is non-metric, the chanter, the leading dancer, and other participants must collaborate closely to move in unison. A sense of solidarity and a form of the emotional power of togetherness can be fostered as a result. Participants thus use the power of togetherness to support or honor certain members or to fulfill social functions of rituals such as the Mangayao, the great hunting ritual. Although the Mangayao originally associated with head hunting practices has been modified to accommodate changes in contemporary society, it still performs traditional functions. 2 major functions of this ritual is to bring the quote-unquote an end to public mourning for the deceased, and to confirm the quote-unquote the political maturity of young headhunters, like the functions of the headhunting ritual of the Sulawesi community in Indonesia, described by Kenneth George. After dancing the Tamarakirao in the Mangayao ritual, the bereaved and the new members of the man's house are incorporated into the village again after phases of separation and liminality in terms of the then general stage of the rites of passage. In the Mangayao, villagers dance around the campfire set in the center of the village square after the hunters return to their village. They begin with a four-step dance, and the bereaved are invited to stand in the front of the line. Friends and relatives will put wreaths on the head of the bereaved when they are dancing. After a couple of rounds of the four-step dance, they perform the Tamaratilau dance. Completing this procedure, the bereaved are now considered cleansed, meaning that the dirt and misfortune brought by death of their family members have been swept off. Following the same procedure, the boys who have completed preparatory training are recognized as men after their mentors have brought them to dance the Tamaratilau. Now I play another clip of the Tamaratilau, at the end of which you can see a mentor brings a boy to the front of the line. As the call for paper of this symposium states, the theme of this symposium is performance pathways, and its notion, quote, emphasizes the purposeful movement of people's music and dances across seas and lands within Oceania and beyond, end quote. This paper has illustrated that the movement of people's music and dances is always dynamic and mutually connected in Taiwanese indigenous performance pathways. And I believe that this may also be applicable to oceanic performance pathways. Unlike many oceanic dance types that tell stories and have close relations with instrumental accompaniments, traditional Taiwanese indigenous dances, as the Tamaratilau exemplifies, do not tell stories and are not accompanied by instruments. To include Taiwan in the discourse of the oceanic performance pathways, however, is not to make superficial comparisons. As I have noted, the Tamaratilau sounds and looks different from village to village within the same county. Even though Buyuma and Baburu villagers can perform the Tamaratilau together, there are still the nuanced differences between the ways of performing it in the two villages that have been separated for less than 1 century. If there was a dance form brought by ancestors from Taiwan to Hawaii millennia ago, why can we expect it keeps unchanged until today? The examples of the Tamaratilau, however, shows that even though differences exist, the common principle of parallelism in lyrics and call and response between voice and body is observed in the performance of the old Binoyumayan villages. Is it possible to find common principles in all Austronesian music and dances beneath their differences on the surface? A large amount of research and collaboration with experts in oceanic studies are needed for answering this question. Presenting this paper at this symposium allows me a good opportunity to start a conversation on this issue, and I look forward to collaborating with you to conduct the comparative studies on Austronesian music and dances. Thank you.
Thank you, Chun Bin. With that, I think we'll move quickly to our third speaker. Giza Yenishan is professor of musicology at the Shanghai Conservatory of Music, and she will give a talk entitled Keeping the Past Under Control, Difficulties of Audiovisual Archiving Across the Asian Pacific Region. Giza, over to you.
I unmute myself. I hope I can be heard. Can I be heard?
Yes, you sound good.
Okay. I shorten it a bit because we are out of time. So I start on my second slide. What is going on? Why it is not moving? No. Communities all over the world, this is an important point to consider, are not containing a music culture that is pure in its essence. Cultural belongings change and move forward at any given time. It is a responsibility of those people trusted by the community in terms of accumulating knowledge to not simplify their ideas about society through labels. If the singular culture as such does not exist, it might be very logical that relations between cultures are just measured in the density of certain features, not in any absolute belonging that could be nationally or even locally claimed. Recently, I take this initial thought everywhere I go and hope that it spreads slowly. At the moment I see the need of it, the more I see that a number of fellow scholars in their rightful try to overcome colonization are merely to stitch labels in a refined way. I want to overcome the romantic view on our timely sacrifices. We all have some. The yelling for economic benefits in the music industry, the complaints of teaching staff who are left without orientation, and the tears of curators looking at the rapid decay of physical items in the wake of the digital age. Again, cultural belongings change and move forward at any given time. In this moment we watch this presentation, things change. Here is an example from Borneo, 10 years old. Villagers were asked to identify the place and time of the recording. Those who left their village only once per year for less than a week were 100% right. Those who studied abroad were the worst. You can see in the order of points I made. Number 1. Can you hear?
We can hear you, Gisa. There's some feedback coming through, but it seems to have stopped.
Do you hear this?
We can hear Gisa. Thank you.
To all of you, it may sound a bit same, but not to others. Every kind of music summarizes experience. It is up to us to decode it. For this, we must study more than music. The condition for this demand of knowing more than music ignores a bit the fact that music in itself is a knowledge that is not yet well studied in this regard, and that archives are not yet well equipped in support of. So far, knowledge in or as music is there because there is no other thing to keep it. What kind of knowledge might this be? This is a very basic question, however, it is rarely put. If anywhere, this might be found first in the Asian Pacific region. It might be here where it is most essential, where humans cannot be the dominating center of the universe. Every source of knowledge is based on previous knowledge. There is no absolute original. There might be only a specific talent and attractively combine and conclude. The attraction is relative and depends on time, place, and people. Is this definition of conditions indeed a part of music and dance studies? Is that in the scope of what archivists do to point out the temporality of views? Isn't methodology that is often taken up as if that is a personal protection shield, stitching labels? Okay, a few bold scholars may question if the right label is stitched. Still, where are those who principally question the labeling? A few weeks ago, I read about discoveries in the area of the large museums and research institutions around Berlin-Dahlem that show human body parts having once been investigated and labeled. They were sent to this place from the early human zoos and should prove the superiority of recent humans in Central Europe. After World War II, the remains were quickly buried among the ruins and under the streets. The problem with these discoveries is a provided proof that the racial idea was already widely spread before any state racism became popular. Scientists, anthropologists, ethnographers, and archivists took part in establishing this. And therefore, it is tremendously important to start early with principal questions and not to wait until there are cases to which, for example, labeling is applied. YASA had a great slogan for its annual World Conference in the year 2008. No archive is an island. It took further 12 years in the Pacific region full of true islands to learn that indeed no archive can survive as an island. The isolation of islands is a physical fact, yet the archival work is today bound to a hybrid way of bridging the virtual and the real world. Neglecting this fact can turn out to be romantic, but also dangerous in long term. As the following efforts of the ICTM show, there was put up a series of panels under the umbrella headline towards decolonization of music and dance studies. In the call for contributions appeared then a shy wish of the aim to decenter power hierarchies, which in turn also implies the existence of power hierarchies within these studies. This is unfortunately not named as the main issue. Just the centralizing seems to be a problem. I have shown this picture in a recent seminar for discussion. The photography was made by Don Niles. There are no issues with copyright or anything like that. Yet there are some small problems too. It was used to promote the ICTM dialogues that started this year. I watched it online and listened carefully to the framing of questions. In the seminar, shortly before this online event, where I have shown the picture, it was said in the discussion, the clothes are not frequently worn. They show fold lines. The instruments are still tried out and may not have been made for an ensemble. There are only women. Is that what it means? Someone guessed that these ladies have all a mobile phone in their pockets. The bangles and the decoration seem unfamiliar to them. The green leaves in the belt seem to derive from the same plant and might have been added in a hurry rather than having been selected with some meaningful thoughts. And the persons and their appearance are made to be representations of the others. Also, the picture makes the onlookers believe that the other can be seen. In summary, the photographer may not have had any intention to imply anything like that. Yet there are implications, whether they are agreeable or not. This is from the panel introduction of the most recent part of this series under the title Collaborative Methodologies for Decentering Power Hierarchies in Education, Artistic Research and Museum Curating. And it says a lot of what is not said. For example, suggesting to study non-elite forms and cultures from below is actually a pretty colonial idea. It not only acknowledges the existence of the opposite and emphasizes a scholarly divide, It also puts historically changing expressiveness as a form. Forms are not content and can willingly switch and be taken at any point into another commodified context, something that is possibly interpreted with a promotion picture. The same goes for the request of the voices from indigenous and non-indigenous scholars, as if a constructed indigeneity would mark a different quality. It also may allow non-indigenous scholars to continue with their unknowingness, as they are kind of socially unable to understand, simply due to that fact. Nevertheless, the goodwill and the efforts are remarkable and should not be neglected. The pictures show another trendy topic across all regions of the world, among them the least powerful who strive for survival. The alibi of the arts in justifying business ideas is a challenge to any type of archiving in the region. While the left hand wants to help the survivors, the right hand may hesitate in doing so for reasons that go beyond one's lifetime. There is no vision or mission in play. Any term is taken as a proof or as a headline. Archives in the Asian Pacific world have to face a transmission from project-oriented short-term actions in digitizing and distributing, performing and establishing an additional scholarly market, to the rather continuous optimization and long-term and sustaining of any kind of knowledge about everything that has to do with sound or visuality. One day, as everything becomes bits and bytes, this will define other challenges in a virtual sense. As archives are the bridges between the physicality and the virtuality, this step in the future is not less complicated and needs high attention. I don't see that attention yet. The future conditions in the Asian Pacific region may be characterized as follows. First, it is not expected that there will be a higher population density. There might be even less people, but these people will need more space due to increasing personal demands. The role of the family will decrease and new social home constructions can take place, and they already take place. 2, there will be less work that requires biological fitness of the human body. People will feel a decrease in activities and will struggle with another type of exhaustion. There will be a larger need of balancing activities such as performing arts and visual arts. People may search for other types of balancing and develop another creativity through deepening social knowledge. 5, this may call for a wider access to any type of knowledge because monopolizing knowledge will then not lead to more inequality in power access. 6, altogether, people will have to focus on more than one specialization. They have to study more than one time and they have to opt for a wider spectrum of skills. The specific region, the dispersion of people, and the variety of experiences still embraces a joint spirit and is based on social action that can help overcome incrustations in scholarship and the availability of knowledge resources. Now I have to move that by hand. Regarding the control of the past, can be said that the most missing part is not technology or scholarly understanding of physical items. It is mainly a joint vision that allows for this kind of long-term sustaining of sources with an inbuilt social freedom. For this reason, only fundamental social changes can lead to more than some new approaches and to a true destruction of imposed assurances. It is nearly 2 years back that I thought of an abstract for the study group symposium. I changed a bit, yet even in these few weeks since then, I had to change things again. Sorry, the world is a real miracle of which every one of us is a part. We are not looking outside in. It should not play a role whether we come from this region or whether we are indigenous or whether we are rich or poor or the white guy or anyone else. It is the profession and the task that drives us to respect the responsibility given to us in accumulating knowledge. Thank you. And that are my references. I stopped sharing.
Thank you, Giza. And we have a few minutes remaining for questions, I think. One question has been submitted by Don Niles for Junichiro, asking how much was the use of Sing Sing Tumbuna for pop songs locally developed in Madang instead of being encouraged by groups such as Sanguma?
Yeah, I was just writing a reply to Dawn Niles, and thanks Dawn for the question. I think there's a lot of complex things taking place in terms of how exactly the appropriation of the Sinsin Tumbuna transmitted. But at any rate, about the number, that I would say roughly, in the Yabov case, about a quarter of the songs I have taken are actually renditions from the Sinsin Tumbuna. And another very important thing, I guess, is it is not just in terms of number, but actually density, frequency of performance. Some of the tunes, the taking the Sinsin Tumbuna materials are just widely popular, although the number of the case was not so many. And that was the interesting case in the very end of 1990s toward the early 2000s. Then gradually hip hop and these kind of things that began to take place, and the things got changed. So we've got to think about, of course, in terms of number of the cases, but also the occasion and the frequency of the cases, or the influence, kind of qualitative analysis of the cases, and there probably ethnographic field work might be important. And this is, I guess, I just hope if I'm answering your question, Dawn.
Don, are you there?
No. Okay. All right.
Yes, sorry, I am here, Juni. Thank you very much. I'm just, yes, all these things. Long time to must be no looking you. Good to see you. I'm just wondering very briefly if you get a sense that in talking to musicians when you were in Madang, did they point to Sanguma as showing the way for the use of such materials, or did you get the impression that this was something that was coming up? Thank you very much.
Or actually, they didn't really say anything about Sanguma at all. And that was very, very interesting because one of the members, Tony Subam, I think Tony Subam is one of the members, and he at least was with the Sanguma. He's actually from Yabov village. Amazing. He was born in Yabov, related with his mother's side. But nobody mentioned Tony, and I personally spoke with Tony at Mosby, and he said, "Well, no, I'm not in touch with these guys because since high school, I haven't been back home," and that's his answer. So they very little mentioned Sanguma as their role model, but rather like Morobe bands, like Sound of Sia, in Duax. And these Morobe bands are more influential. So probably they get ideas from these bands, or maybe the Sago Thorns and these guys, rather than quote eclectic sort of, the people with high academic career in the Mosby. They don't really identify with them. So interesting, because Ronnie Galama was at that time very popular in the Port Moresby, but they didn't really listen to them. So there are a lot of things to consider, and I'm still very curious about it. Thanks.
Thank you. And we have another question from Rick Tremilios for Juni. Do you not consider ethnopop from PNG as indigenous?
Well, ethnopop from PNG as indigenous. Well, I would say it is indigenous because if I introduce these bands to, for instance, Japan, where I live, I would say that their music is very, very much the grassroots. So whatever which belongs to grassroots, then I would say that's ethnopop as indigenous music. So here is sort of like the double layers of indigenousness are taking place in my example, which is that the materials that taken from the Sinsin Tubuna, in that sense, it's indigenous. but also in terms of the power band music with very specific development. That's another layer of indigenousness. So there are very complex the things that going, taking place. And again, that's, I felt like, that I should share with you all. And is that clear? That's the answer I can make. So I'm not really sticking up with which is indigenous, which is not. Whatever whatever it is rooted in the Medan everyday life. So,
thank you.
Okay.
Don, Giza is asking about the picture. Can you, would you be interested in commenting on that photo?
Yeah, thank you. Giza, I was shocked to see that picture come up. And I was going to write you separately to find out more about where you found it and in what context it was used. But I mean, I guess this was a photograph that I shared with ICTM to be used freely, and I guess that's what happened. But I would guess that many of the comments are probably a little extreme. Yes, this was taken at an area in which there's quite a bit of development going on in certain parts, but where this was taken, there is not. Nevertheless, this was a festival that was going on, and certainly these women did not have mobile phones in their pockets at this performance. I think the costumes were made new, but they certainly would be something that they'd be very familiar with wearing. I didn't hear all of the comments that clearly because my connection is constantly unstable, but I'd be very happy to get the full range of the comments offline and to hear more about that, because I'm very curious on the use of this photograph. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Don. And thank you to all three of our presenters. I think we're probably about out of time. Very interesting and thought-provoking presentations. Thank you. So I think it's back to Brian.
Thank you, Kirk.
You're welcome.
Thank you very much for leading that. And thanks again to all presenters and everyone that's presenting today. Our third day of the symposium begins tomorrow at the same time, and something different. We have two roundtable sessions, one on Pacific arts and COVID-19, and the second on Asia-Pacific connections, something we saw a bit of in the last session. And at the end of the day, tomorrow, we have our ICTM business meeting, which is intended for ICTM members. But if you're interested in the study group and ICTM, we'd certainly encourage you to take part. So thanks again for everyone. We're closed for the day, and we'll see you tomorrow. Kia ora, everyone.
Aloha.
Thank you, Brian.